Good evening, everyone. My name is Mayor Diane Howard, and I've been calling the meeting to order. I want to thank you all for tuning into our virtual City Council meeting tonight of October 5th, 2020. We are going to continue to follow the public health guidance to avoid the spread of COVID-19. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly go over the public comment procedure for the meeting. Members of the public will have the opportunity to comment on the study session item only, which is item number 4 on tonight's agenda, following the city's presentations and the council's questions. Once the public comment period has opened, you may raise your hand feature on Zoom to speak. If you're joining the teleconference by phone, you may raise your hand by dialing *9 and *6 to unmute your microphone when prompted. Each speaker will be allotted 3 minutes, but that time may be adjusted if there are a large number of speakers tonight. During tonight's meeting, we will also be offering Spanish translation services for those who wish to hear the meeting in Spanish. The slide on the screen shows how you can enable this service in Zoom. Please note that if you wish to hear the English translation of any comments given in Spanish, you must switch to the English channel by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and choosing English. If no option is chosen and you remain on the regular channel, please be advised there may be a brief pause of silence while the interpretation is taking place. To listen to the Spanish interpretation by phone, please call 650-241-6780 and enter passcode 101-71017 to access this service. Our interpreter this evening is Gonzalo Cordoba. We are using video this evening for the City Council and for staff on a trial basis as we continue to assess how best to manage online meetings. Council members Aguirre, Bain, Borgens, Hale, Reddy, Vice Mayor Mazur, and myself will participate by teleconference pursuant to Governor Newsom's Executive Order N-29-20. The City Council chambers is not open to the public. The meeting is being broadcast live to Redwood City residents on Astound Broadband Cable Channel 26 and Comcast Cable Channel 27, AT&T UVerse Channel 99, and are streamed live via the city's website at www.redwoodcity.org. I'd now like to ask the city clerk if she will call the roll.
Good evening. Council Member Aguirre.
Here.
Council Member Bain.
Here.
Council Member Borgens.
Here.
Council Member Hale.
Here.
Council Member Reddy.
Here.
Vice Mayor Mazur.
Here.
And Mayor Howard.
Here.
Thank you.
I'd now like to ask Council Member Janet Borgens if she will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please join me while we give salute to the flag of our country. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Council Member Borgens. Moving on to item number 4, our study session, a study session on racial equity and city services. Just a reminder before we begin that this is a study session and no formal action will be taken tonight. Our City Council feedback provided will inform the revised budget, which the City Council will consider at our next meeting on October 26th. The Ad Hoc Committee on Policing, which consists of myself, Vice Mayor Mazur, Council Member Aguirre, will now begin the presentation for the study session. The presentation will be followed by public comment and City Council discussion. I just wanted to clarify something I just said. We will be discussing the revised budget at the last council meeting in October, which is October 26th. And now we will begin our presentation on racial equity, city services, and policing. Redwood City is part of an important national conversation about racial equity. Community members have shared opinions, experiences, and perspectives over the last 3 months, including direct communication to council members, participation in city council meetings, participation in a June 10th virtual town hall, and participation in dialogue sessions and pop-up events. Residents have identified their concerns regarding racial disparities in policing and other city services, as well as concerns regarding racial disparities in the criminal justice system as a whole, education, and housing. Many residents have urged action and new approaches. Some residents have expressed appreciation for the city's current approach to policing and concern about significant changes. This report provides context for potential next steps, including information about existing city policy and practices, community engagement in the last several months, and focus areas recommended by the City Council's Ad Hoc Committee on Policing. I want to start by acknowledging these are sensitive and difficult issues to discuss. We know that many in our community have experienced racism and injustice, and it is personally painful. We know that many in our community are seeking new approaches to better live into our shared values of equal justice and equal opportunity. And we know that there are widely varying opinions among our residents about how we should do this. We are not shying away from these difficult discussions. We are seeking meaningful steps forward. We appreciate all who have communicated with us in recent months and look forward to moving forward together. Now you'll see the agenda item overview on your screen. I'll briefly go over it. The background presentation will be given by the Ad Hoc Committee on Policing. Community dialogues on racial equity, policing, and city services will be given by the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center, or PCRC. What we've heard and learned by the Ad Hoc Committee, recommended next steps, the Ad Hoc Committee on Policing. We will then have public comment and then City Council discussion with no action this evening. Feedback will inform our decisions for budget on October 26th. I'd now like to ask Vice Mayor Mazur if she would like to address the next slide.
Sure, I think I have a couple of slides. First of all, thank you to everybody who's attending. We appreciate your engagement with us, continued engagement with us on this issue. I'll just start off by saying that, as many of you know, on several occasions, the city has declared a commitment to racial equity and inclusion as a matter of public policy. One example in 2017 was when we declared Redwood City a welcoming city. The next incidents, yeah, there, thank you. And then we next adopted a proclamation supporting United Against Hate in 2018. We then, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, just reviewing really quickly for people who weren't attending council meetings at that time. And then I'm going to let Councilmember Aguirre address a few other instances.
Councilmember, you're on mute.
Councilmember Aguirre?
Yes, thank you. I apologize for that. Okay, thank you, Vice Mayor Mazur. So at the beginning, what we've been able to do is that we've been able to establish, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go between screens and I apologize for the delay. So as I look at this background that we talked about with our vision statement, what we've been able to do is establish a broadly inclusive vision statement when adopting a new strategic plan at the beginning of this year. And if we look at this, back in August, the City Council adopted a resolution declaring that Black Lives Matter, reaffirming the city's commitment to racial equity and committing to numerous action-oriented steps. Okay, Mayor, it's leaving it with you.
The members of our City Council Ad Hoc Committee on Policing, myself, Vice Mayor Shelley Mazer, and Council Member Alicia Aguirre. The committee charge was to work with the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center, or PCRC, and city staff on community engagement, coordinate with staff on ensuring progress on police-related recommendations, including with the adoption of the fiscal year 2020-2021 budget, provide guidance to staff on other actions to enhance police-related activities in Redwood City, and report out regularly to the City Council and the community. Our City Manager will speak next.
Thank you, Mayor Howard. So this graphic shows the breadth of the work that the committee and staff have been working on in the last several months. And we won't go over all of it, but we've been doing a fair amount of work, researching alternate models for police oversight and service delivery, reviewing critical police policies, and meeting with stakeholders as part of this broad community engagement that we've been describing. I also want to make sure to note that the council and the city as a whole have been taking action, even as we've been doing all of this engagement, including, as was committed to in June, returning the surplus military vehicle that had been donated to the department, and as the council did in August, identifying meaningful steps to really help us look forward into ways to improve equity in the city organization and in our work with our boards and commissions. I need to note that all of this work has happened at the same time as we've been dealing with unprecedented health and economic crises. Additionally, the committee received a report on alternative policing strategies, practices, and structures from Stanford University researcher Joyce Tegal. My counterparts in Mountain View and Palo Alto and I all asked for this report earlier this summer, which focused on a review of academic and organizational literature, interviews with Stanford faculty and community experts, as well as case studies at peer cities. The report identified several short and long-term actions in the areas of data collection, culture change, and independent oversight. The committee's recommendations this evening are grounded in this research, as well as numerous webinars and other informational learning opportunities that the committee members and staff have engaged in over the last several months. One important takeaway from this research is the importance of using local data and working with local resources as we develop an approach that works well for Redwood City.
In an effort to hear more community voices more thoroughly, we contracted with the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center, or PCRC, to conduct a series of 6 online community dialogues on racial equity throughout the summer. The sessions were intended to help the city create meaningful change in city's policies, service delivery, and policing. We appreciate PCRC's work, and we really thank them for working with our community. And I'd now like to call on Michelle Vilches from PCRC to introduce their presentation. Michelle?
Thank you, Mayor. Hello and good evening to City Council, Redwood City Council, and of course, the community of Redwood City. It is really our pleasure to be able to report on the Redwood City Community Dialogue project. that we have been working with in conjunction to the ad hoc committee. As stated, my name is Michelle Viches, and I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the Executive Director with the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center. For those of you who are not familiar, we are a 35-year-old organization that actually has very deep roots in Redwood City. We partner with individual groups and institutions to empower people, build relationships, and ultimately to reduce violence through our collaborative and innovative processes. So we really are excited about this project and being able to really share it with those of you who logged on. I am joined by two distinguished colleagues of mine. One is Melissa Netane Jones, who serves as our Managing Director over Services and Initiatives. And I'm also here with Jose Lopez, who is our Manager of Facilitation Services, both of which who were very specific in their work and very strategic in their work that they conducted for this particular project. And so I'm going to hand it up this time to Melissa, or invite Melissa Netane Jones to log on with me and present about the project outreach. And then Jose will be talking very specifically about the outcomes and overview of the dialogues themselves. Melissa?
Thank you so much, Michelle. And again, thank you to our partnership with the City of Redwood City. I'm going to go ahead and go into sort of the topics that we're going to discuss in our part of the presentation this evening. We are going to go over our engagement plan, our outreach. We're also going to talk a little bit about the statistics that were gathered based on our engagement with the community of the polls and responses. We'll also share the small group themes and summarize the overall project in partnership with the City of Redwood City. Next slide, thank you. So we're so grateful to the City of Redwood City to be able to partner on this project and to be able to conduct the outreach for this work, which is probably one of the most crucial parts of this project, is to really be able to engage, excuse me, the different communities. And after speaking with our city council members and the ad hoc committee, we wanted to make sure that we were able to engage as many individuals in the City of Redwood City as we could to be able to participate in the listening sessions. There was very targeted outreach to individuals of Redwood City who traditionally may not engage in civic opportunities. And we worked with our internal PCRC outreach team to be able to provide that outreach. And so we did pop-ups, which were ways for our staff to be able to physically do community outreach in areas that were either heavy populated or were frequently visited by individuals, to hand out flyers, engage them about the listening sessions, and also offer opportunities to help them register should they need it. Our staff is able to provide outreach in the Spanish language, as well as Tongan and English. And if there were any other individuals that required other languages, we were able to help to try and do the outreach in that language. It was very important for individuals, in order for them to be engaged, to really feel like this was an inclusive process. And so we also did a lot of electronic outreach due to the COVID-19 restrictions. It is a very different way to do outreach for a lot of the work since March of this year. And in order to protect the City of Redwood City residents as well as our staff, we had to pivot a lot of our outreach to engage community members through other modalities, such as emails, texts, calls. We utilize social media to various community organizations, as well as engaging partnerships that we had already had in the City of Redwood City to be able to leverage engagement with their constituents, clients, or those that they served in the community. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of the outreach that was conducted in Redwood City. As you can see that this list is broken up into two different sections, both pop-up as well as email, text, and call. Something that I want to just highlight was because of COVID-19, it was challenging that although we did recognize that there were a lot of, that there had been a lot of community unrest and interested individuals in what was happening around policing and equity. Some of the communities that we reached out to, such as our Latino population, our Pacific Islander population, it was very challenging for them to be able to prioritize speaking with us and with dealing with COVID restrictions such as unemployment, food, and education. So it was very hard for them to really engage in the conversation. However, they did say that it was very important for them. The map shows the areas in which there was outreach given to, and it was very important for the city and the ad hoc committee to make sure that we reached out to communities that were either vulnerable or had not participated in the past, but really, really wanted to engage them to be able to elevate their voice in this process. So again, our staff was able to visit some of these areas and pop up. And because sometimes individuals were still trying to figure out what was happening locally and on a national level around civil unrest and policing and equity, our staff had to spend some time to express the need for their engagement, the hopes and the desires of the city to have them elevate their voice, in which we also had to sort of ask the questions that we were asking in the listening sessions to the community members, and were able to collect that information as well. We had targeted populations of our African American community, our elderly community, the homeless population, those who were sort of on the outskirts of Redwood City, to ensure that they knew about the listening sessions and that they were able to engage in the process. Another challenge that we sort of experienced while we were doing engagement was still some individuals were very unfamiliar with navigating electronics and engaging in a Zoom call. They only had a phone, so we were teaching them how to upload Zoom to be able to participate. We were also working with individuals around how to just use the Zoom platform in itself to be able to do it. We had outreached to over 1,000 individuals in Redwood City, trying to get them to be able to register and then to be able to attend. So our outreach team worked very hard to be able to engage more Redwood City individuals in this process. And then I'll turn the time now over to Jose to kind of get into more detail about those.
Good evening, everybody. Would I be able to get the video on? I can't, I don't see my video and I can't turn it on this end.
Jose, we're checking, but it appears we can't turn it on. If there's anything else you can do on your end?
I'm clicking on it and it says unable to start video. You can't start video because the host has stopped it. That's fine. I can continue with the discussion.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time this evening. Thank you, Melissa and Michelle, for the opportunity to be able to be here and talk to the community about what we were able to sort of discuss. Okay, I think I got the video. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good evening. All right, so really quick, so I'm gonna quickly talk about a couple things that happened on the Zoom platform. As you all know, this is a new platform or a new way of engaging with the community in terms of outreach and in terms of registration and attendance. I'm gonna quickly go over 3 poll questions that we had in our Zoom session, which namely focused on demographics, perspectives, and the evaluation of the evening, like how people felt about how it went and how they feel about in terms of the engagement. And then we're going to cover 3 general categories of what the small group discussions were able to be were broken down into. One being the city, the other one being police, and then finally schools. But first of all, I want to quickly start with registration and attendance. For registration, as the numbers here are represented, we had about 405 people register, which is a good indication of like the people that were incentivized enough to go in and say, I want to sort of hear what's happening. They have to register, and of course, they have to attend the event. In terms of attendance and the way that Zoom accounts for attendance is unique users. And so unique users can register to a Zoom, jump in and out. And so, for example, some people were there for 15 minutes, some people were there for 60, some people were there for the whole 2 hours of the session. So in terms of attendance, these are unique users. And so despite the fact that in the evening, when we were doing the sessions, the numbers hovered at a certain rate, the overall numbers of people jumping in and out throughout the evening are suggested here. And so of the 405 people that registered, 346 actually attended the evening at some point in the evening. Okay, so let's go ahead and to the next slide. And then, so in terms of the demographics, one of the questions that we asked is whether they lived, worked, or went to school in Redwood City. And so for the people that lived and worked, and so there's 3 questions: one, whether they lived, whether they worked, and whether they lived and worked. About 89% of the people that attended actually lived and or worked in Redwood City, which is great. So the good majority of them. And in terms of ethnicity, the majority were white, about 51% of the folks there. However, 49% of them were Latino, Black, and or Asian. And so the numbers that are here represented are the actual numbers. And of course, I'm giving the percentages as we go. So if we can go to the next slide. And so we have age and gender. In terms of age, the majority of the folks there in the evening were 35 to 54. And in terms of gender, about 67% were female. Next slide. So here we come to the gauging perspectives, and we've actually, so the first set of questions were asked at the beginning, these set of questions were asked in the middle, and then the evaluation questions were asked at the end. These questions were a little more explicit about what they were doing in terms of that evening, in terms of the themes. And so the first question is, I am concerned that Redwood City will reduce funding for the police and won't have enough police service for a safe community. And what I've done is I've combined either the strongly agree or strongly disagree, or the or strongly agree and agree for the next 2 slides, because that's either for or against this specific question. And so in regards to reducing funding for the police, 77% of the people that participated in the polls said they were not concerned about reducing funding for the police. For the next perspective question, and then the symbolic change was 75%. And so the next slide, we have 3 questions. And so the first question is, I can be proud of who I am and celebrate others who are different from me, even if I don't understand them yet. 95% said strongly agree and agree. The next question is, I believe that Redwood City as a community has a lot of work to do to become better at welcoming diverse experiences. 75% thought that they can do better. Again, combination of agree and strongly agree. And finally, within this slide is, I believe Redwood City is a welcoming place that honors individuals regardless of their race, background, gender, sexual orientation, and faith. 55% said it is welcoming. It's important to point out that 30% said neutral in that specific question. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And then here we come to the evaluation polls. This is, if anything, some immediate feedback as to how the community felt about the Zoom process. Again, everything was online and everything was new, relatively new for folks. And so for the first question, I learned something new tonight from someone else in the community. 95% of the people that attended said yes. I heard something that resonated with my own experience. 93% of the people that attended said yes. And I felt heard and respected tonight. 87% of the people that attended that evening to join the dialogue said yes as well. And so next slide. Finally, in terms of the evaluation, and this is going to conclude our polls, is I am interested in future community engagement sessions. 92% said yes, and so that was encouraging in terms of the discussion that happened within these small group dialogues, but also future plans for the city. The people that attended were definitely interested in having more of these sessions. And then finally, how helpful was this meeting? When combining 5s and 4s, 76% of the people that attended said that these meetings were helpful. Next slide, please. This brings us to the themes of the evening. And so these themes were the notes that we captured from the small group discussions. Every evening when we had a community dialogue, we divided into either anywhere from 3 to 10 small group sessions that had anywhere from 7 to 12 people. We had a facilitator and we had a note taker. And then we asked the following questions. What experiences did you have with racial equity in Redwood City? What needs to be addressed? And then what suggestions do you have to address them? And when answering these questions, three main categories arose. Like I said before, we have the city, the responses to the city, responses to the police, and responses to the school system in Redwood City. When it comes to the Redwood City governance, and this was the one that was most spoken about in terms of frequency, and these are the amount of times that they came up within the groups and the various group sessions and community dialogues that happened. In terms of cost of living, and people referred to affordable housing, poverty, living wages, that one was the most frequent theme that happened within the discussion, at least for the city. In terms of more transparency, things like city data, independent advisory came up. More social services. People were referring to social workers, social programs, whether through the library or through any sort of resources that the city had. And in terms of representation and diversity, a request for representation within the city governance to institutionalize community voice, right, to diversify the leadership was something that was brought up. And then finally, city gentrification and segregation, which is to some extent connected to cost of living in terms of gentrification, was frequently brought up as well. And so we move on to the next slide. This is where we come to the city police. And even though there was some overlap in terms of representation and diversity between the city themes and the police themes, these are specifically themes that came up for the police. And so when it comes to descoping or descope or defund the police, a combination of different things fell within this category, anything from SROs to the work that they're doing with a potential work within social work or non-emergency scenarios. And so for those of you that are not familiar with the term descope, is the idea is to reduce or revise the scope of what the police are doing. In terms of police harassment, that one's pretty straightforward. In terms of police training, training on de-escalation was brought up. Training on implicit bias was brought up. training on potential history of the community, specifically within communities of color or low-income communities, was brought up as a suggestion to have better community relations. And of course, police transparency and accountability in terms of data, independent audits, and potential actions that come of it in terms of an independent, impartial sort of entity to be able to provide that accountability. And then finally, police diversity in terms of representation from the city and reflecting the communities that they serve. Next slide, please. And so we end with the school system. Despite the fact that it's just one sort of item on here, it was across all sectors that everybody brought up school inequality in terms of resources and segregation as an important thing to bring up, especially for communities of color and especially as a focal point of inequality in the city that is influenced by the influx of high cost and things that were pointed out before. And so with that, that concludes the findings and the themes within the small group discussion that we had within these sessions that we had. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. There we go. Thank you, Jose, very, very much, and Michelle, both of you, and all members of the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center who helped us during this time. And now, each member of our ad hoc committee would like to talk about what we heard and learned at the different community dialogue sessions and from the many meetings and conversations with stakeholders from throughout our community. I'd like to ask Councilwoman Alicia Aguirre if she would begin.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, I participated, I think, in the majority of them in the community dialogues, and the concerns about policing came up in every meeting, but the one that stands out to me the most is the one that we organized for the Spanish speakers. And as PCRC pointed out, we heard a lot of, wasn't directly related to policing, but more fundamental needs of the community. What did they really need? They were there, they had a platform, it was important, but the issues that were there were about food insecurity, dealing with job loss, and the threat of losing their homes, their apartments. And it was a good reminder to me, there are a lot of people that we were elected to serve that we don't hear from regularly. And I think what was really important about this event, that we were able to hear them, that they were able to come out and speak to us. So my takeaway was like, we need to make sure that we are committed to continuing to have these types of dialogues for a variety of reasons. This one being very important, but also how do we move forward in helping provide food, delivery, rental assistance, and all the problems that are real for our folks. I know everyone on this council is committed to racial equity, and that I think we just need to keep looking at how we ensure that we're really walking the talk the best to our ability and take it a step further and actually have some actionable items.
Thank you, Councilmember Aguirre. Vice Mayor Mazur.
Thank you. I want to say I do agree with Alicia, and I also do think that there were some really consistent messages about racial equity in the context of policing in the criminal justice system. You know, since George Floyd's murder in June, the city has heard from hundreds of residents regarding racial equity, and so it's obviously a national conversation. And our responsibility is to figure out, like, what do these challenges mean for Redwood City, and that's what the listening sessions were about. So community members and advocacy groups have done a tremendous amount of research. They've brought their own experiences and shared suggestions about best practices for reconsidering how we deal with challenges related to mental health and substance abuse, as one example. They made some compelling arguments that there are better solutions than expecting our police officers, as well trained as committed as we know they are, to respond to problems that really don't belong in the criminal justice system to begin with. And I think the community has really challenged us to look at doing things in new and in different ways. And I'll just say, you know, as a person who has done work in the area of public health for many years, I'm pleased to see us trying to figure out that mix and how we address the needs of our community.
Thank you. Well, I agree with both Alicia and Shelley. In addition to the issues they've described, I was really struck by how frustrated so many members of the community were with feels like a lack of transparency and communication from and with the city. I know we really try to do a good job at this. Our staff works very hard on updating our website and producing e-newsletters, and the council welcomes public comment at every council meeting. But we have a lot of people in our community who we never hear from and who we rarely reach through our traditional communication channels. So I think we need to think more about how we strengthen our understanding of our community and our accountability to the community. The community dialogues were a good start, but we need to keep committing ourselves to listening to as many people as possible and in many different ways. And we need to organize and share our information with more transparency. So I'd like to now turn it over to our Chief of Police, Dan Mulholland.
Thank you, Mayor, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. Very clearly, we heard, and I heard throughout this process, that our community wants a compassionate, a transparent, and community-oriented police department. As an organization, we tried very hard for very long to build a very solid foundation in this area, and we've expanded some of our programming related to community policing. If you look at our community, our juvenile services unit, we try to support families through programs like our Crossing the Limits anti-bullying presentations. We've conducted parent project parenting classes in both English and Spanish. We've done quite a bit of work to prevent and address domestic violence through family interventions, through offerings of family counseling services, and through partnering with CORA, an organization called Community Overcoming Relationship Abuse, to help victims immediately following domestic violence events, helping them with housing and financial support and counseling services. And we also heard of the importance of making sure that our officers have the proper amount of training in diversity and implicit bias. And some of that training is required once every 5 years. And some of it is required every 2 years. And we felt that it was important to accelerate that timeline and ensure that we're offering that training on a 2-year cycle, not a 2 and a 5 year. And that's being done so we can reinforce these values to the organization and prove how important it is to both improve and strengthen our culture within the organization. And with all that we've heard, I understand that we can do more as an organization. We're exploring new ways of further connecting with the community in this COVID environment and what we can do as a police department to offer support. But I also very much look forward to the ideas that this committee will present and what our community will present moving forward that can create a greater expectation for the police department and understand what your police department can do more to serve the community of Redwood City. And with that, I would now like to turn it over to our city manager, Melissa Stevenson-Diaz, to offer comments on the next slide.
Thank you, Chief Mulholland. And I also want to thank you for your leadership and for your constructive engagement and open minds throughout this process. You and the department have been active participants in listening together with the community. A few things that I took away from all of the conversations that we've had in different forms in the last several months, probably 3. The first is around data and realizing that there are a lot of shared interests around using data for decision making and for shaping how we provide services. And I've come to realize we haven't been doing enough to collect the right information and to share that in a way that's easily accessible for our residents. And that's something we need to do better at. Also heard a lot of broad community concern around equity in education and concern for vulnerable populations. And here too, I think this is really a shared value and something that the city leadership and many staff have been working on for some time. I think we're really fortunate to have a tremendous resource in Redwood City, and that is Redwood City 2020. It's a community collaborative that brings together leaders in the government sphere, in health, in education, and in the nonprofit segment to try to work better together using data as a foundation to meet the needs of students and families, and particularly to address the impacts of poverty. They're doing terrific work right now in developing a new strategic plan, which will have important measures that will help us all see progress. And I'm proud to be part of that leadership along with Vice Mayor Mazur. And then I also heard a lot of interest from residents around hoping and wanting broader community understanding around racism. We know we're part of a national dialogue. We're not separate from it. And we heard from many people who want more opportunities to talk about this legacy. Last year, we received a state grant to launch a program in our library called Redwood City Public Library Cares. And our staff have curated anti-racism reading lists, hosted programs and events designed by community members who are from underrepresented populations. They've hosted a number of events to reflect our diverse community and promoting learning for all ages, including discussions such as how to talk with kids about race. The library's also offered bystander intervention training. And as much as I know that all that work has been going on, I think many in our community are not aware of that. And we heard from many folks who are hoping for that kind of work and maybe don't know that it is underway. So we have more work to do as staff to make sure we're reaching more people who are interested in this kind of programming.
And now I'd like to give the Ad Hoc Committee on Policing recommendations and share them with the community and with the City Council for discussion. Based on this work over the last several months, we've been recommending a creation of a multi-year equity work plan. We envision 3 focus areas: equity in public safety, equity in all other city services, and equity in the community as a whole, and 3 actions in each area. So I'd like to ask Vice Mayor Mazur if she would begin with the first recommendation.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll start off with actions, as you can see, actions to enhance equity and public safety. So the first thing, we did hear a lot of recommendations about the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, as well as a few other similar programs. And we heard from our researcher at Stanford about other opportunities to think about how do we respond to mental health crises. So our program, our recommendation is a pilot program with the county and I think 3 other cities. It's not to respond with mental health clinicians, with police officers. It may not end up with a program identical to the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, but it is inspired by the same goals. And as we said, it's a pilot, so we'll be assessing its effectiveness as we go through it. Secondly, we're recommending that staff increase data collection, data analysis, and data sharing. I think that's something we heard a lot from the community, was they wanted to know what did it look like, what was our data showing us. And that's why we are committed to collecting and sharing more. So we're going to be looking at use of force, interactions with members of the public, particularly looking about the breakdown of service calls and employee-initiated activities. So when our staff is out talking to community or in community, public safety activity by geographic areas of service, where are the police operating most frequently, demographic characteristics for employees that are hired and promoted. A bit of a challenge because it's self-reported, but it's something we'll be working on. Analysis of Redwood City data compared to other agencies, and then also one that we heard a call for a lot of was the number, type, and disposition, the type of complaints made against our city police officers and what happens. So we're working on making that information more available. And then we're also recommending to create a new City Council Public Safety Committee. And as you know, we've all been operating as an ad hoc, which operates differently from a permanent standing committee. Permanent standing committee means that the notice of committee meetings is posted, there's public participation, so it would operate a little bit differently from the ad hoc committee. It'll be charged with continuing to review the use of force policies. We've started that in the ad hoc committee on policing, and we also talked about it in our resolution on August 10th to review police use of force policies, consider changes, and report our findings back to the community. Secondly, it'll be reviewing annual reports regarding the number, type, and disposition, what happens with complaints made against the city police officers. Additionally, it'll be providing feedback to staff on proposals for modifying our public safety delivery models, and what type of citizen engagement might we look at for working with our police. I think that's it.
Shelley, were you going to elaborate on?
Yeah. Yes, I was. Thank you for asking. Got a little bit ahead of myself.
Thank you for doing it.
So I started to talk about oversight, and we heard a lot from residents advocating for specific oversight approaches. So as you can see, this was a result of the data that and research that we received from Stanford. And she talked to us about different levels of trust within the community. And so you can see the three different levels, from strained but not broken to a deep erosion of trust. So with each of those, where you look at a different model of citizen engagement and oversight. So our recommendation is that we want to discuss further sort of where are we in terms of this level of trust. And then as a result of that level of trust, how do we want to provide citizen oversight? So I think I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Aguirre now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice Mayor Mazur. Councilmember Aguirre.
Thank you, Mayor. So moving on to some of the committee recommendations. These are actions to enhance equity in all other city services. Number one, make equity a foundational guiding principle in the city's strategic plan. And number two, fund diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives for all employees, and increase diversity of volunteer leadership and support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for volunteer leadership. And as we were looking at these, we've indicated that we want equity as our foundation to work through all of our strategic plan. We expect the council will approve specific language when we bring this back on October 12th. And we also want to support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for city employees and for all of our volunteer leadership, like our boards, committees, and commissions. So as you can see, equity is at the top of all of our strategic plans of the cities, the employees, the leadership, and also our community.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Aguirre. And the third focus is actions to enhance equity in the Redwood City community. We will enhance equity in education with our partnership, Redwood City 2020, which is a wonderful partnership we have with the county, the city, various hospitals within the community, the school districts, the high school, the college, and the elementary school district, working together to enhance equity in education. Work with the Belmont Redwood Shores School District to enhance equity in education, and clarify the role of the school resource officer. So that is our recommendation, and we look forward to the City Council discussion tonight. I was so happy when I saw this. Thank you so much. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away not too long ago, and it made us all very, very sad. She has many wonderful things she has said that inspired us for years. Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time. Pretty profound and pretty true. So she's going to help lead us forward as we make the changes we need to make in Redwood City. I wanted to finish by saying I'm very proud of our police department and all of our city departments. I also know we are always striving to improve and do our best to meet community needs. In Redwood City and as a country, we are asking hard questions. We have to work to do healing, heal the divides, and to ensure that everyone in our community has equal justice and equal opportunity. It won't happen overnight, but it can happen one step at a time. We want to take those steps together. So at this point, I would like to, if there are any clarifying questions from council, I do not see any hand raised, so it will be time for public comment. At this time, we'll take public comment on the study session item. If you wish to make a public comment at this time, please click the raise hand button on Zoom to be recognized. If you're joining by phone, press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself when prompted to speak. Again, we are offering Spanish interpretation for any members of the public who wish to give public comment in Spanish. To utilize this service, please follow the instructions on the screen. Our interpreter this evening is Gonzalo Cordova. Please note that if you wish to hear the English translation of any comments given in Spanish, you must switch to the English channel. You would click on that channel and press the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and choose English. If no option is chosen and you remain on the regular channel, please be advised that there may be brief pauses of silence while the interpretation is taking place. Now, in order to see how many speakers we have tonight, I'd like to ask anyone who wishes to speak under public comment if you might raise your hand so that we can see who would like to speak. At this time, I have 16 hands raised. I'd like to ask, give it some thought. If you'd really like to speak, please put your hand up now so that we can gauge the time for the evening. I have 20 speakers at this time, 21. It's an opportunity for you even just to say, I agree with the report or I agree with the previous speaker. You don't have to take the whole time allotted. Okay, at this time, we have 23 speakers. And my last speaker is Amanda Doherty. So at this time, I would like to say that I am going to give each speaker 2 minutes, and that will give each person 2 minutes to speak and plenty of time for the council to go over the recommendations that have been submitted. So at this time, I'm going to call 2 names. I'll call first name and the second name will be queuing up behind. So my first speaker is Michael Smith, followed by Pat W.
Hello, Mayor, members of the City Council, and members of the public. My name is Michael Smith. I'm a Redwood City resident, a City Planning Commissioner, and a co-chair for the Palm Park Neighborhood Association. This past April, I was able to join several of the co-organizers of the March for Black Lives, responding to the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of law enforcement in Minneapolis and St. Louis. In collaboration, Des Frazier, one of the protest organizers, and several other community members shared what we felt were reasonable, timely, and actionable recommendations that we shared with the City Council, City Manager, Chief of Police, shortly after the protest. As a bit of a reminder, we suggested the development of a citizens policing committee, greater transparency on use of force and race-based complaint data, an independent audit of the Redwood City Police Department use of force from an outside audit firm, and finally, the diversion of police budget toward community and behavioral health-based community servicing programs. After an initial meeting, Mayor Howard, Vice Mayor Macer, City Manager Diaz, and Chief Mulholland agreed to move forward with a series of listening sessions facilitated by PCRC and a City Council subcommittee with the goal of bringing forward a number of recommendations. We were eager to move forward with the implementation of these recommendations, but we were pleased with how deliberative the city intended to be, considering the importance of this issue. All in all, we are pleased with how the listening sessions went and how the qualitative input were brought by PCRC. We agree that there was a broad range of experiences that were shared, but we thought that some were productive and some really showed the difficult issues that policing has dealt with in Redwood City for some time. Having reviewed the recommendations from staff, we believe that the city is headed in the right direction. We are pleased to see the inclusion of behavioral health pilot program, an inclusion of an equity focus for the strategic plan, and a reorientation of the use of public safety and use of force data with greater transparency. With that said, we do believe there are several areas of discussion to be clearly considered. First, timing. How long will this process take to be stood up? Number two, we believe the council should not hesitate to move forward with a committee of public safety as a BCC rather than a subcommittee. And we also believe that the council should consider budgeting as a part of this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. My next speaker is Pat W. and then John Pimentel.
I raise my hand to comment about staff recommendation item 4A. And we're at the San Mateo County plan to address homelessness and people with mental illness. All of the mobile interactions with these communities or these populations go through armed police officers driving around with weaponized squad cars. First, let me point out that everyone living in the United States, when a squad car rolls up on them, the first thought that comes to their mind is, oh, expletive, what have I been doing wrong? The police-oriented approach of contact is is disturbing and seems to be primarily a matter of convenience and low cost. It is my hope that, and data of undoubtedly thousands of Redwood City residents, that this city participates in the pilot program in a somewhat modified fashion from what has been defined, even with no need for other cities to participate in the same fashion. First, thank the county for loaning us one of their mental health clinicians and ask for a half dozen. Our pilot doesn't run or would not run through the police department, but instead through people dedicated full-time, even if a short-term basis for the pilot, to respond to these populations. This pilot team would consist of people who are unarmed, without weaponized vehicles with multicolored lights on the roof. They drive around the city day shift and night shift looking for people in need of social services rather than people with weapons. I don't see it being worthwhile to spend a year on a pilot program apparently defined more for its convenience rather than its efficacy. And if it's more meaningfully defined, will prove its worth and point and be switched to a permanent basis instead of having to fix it more down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. John Pimentel and then Lizette. John, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Sean Pimentel, and I'm here speaking on behalf of the Redwood City Police Activities League. And there's much attention in the report to the police department's mission, tactics, training, and people. Many excellent ideas for much needed reforms have been discussed in the report. There are many families in the PAL community who could testify to the mistakes that have been made in the past and to encourage the new approaches that are being considered by the report. We're encouraged by the Redwood City Police Department's openness to change, and we support their support of many of the reforms that came up through the community forums. However, some families from the communities we serve in North Fair Oaks, Stambaugh Heller, Friendly Acres, Redwood Village have not had the time, inclination, or opportunity to participate in the community forums. And PAL would like to formally invite the police department, the council, and anyone else in the community to engage with the Redwood City PAL if they'd like to have a more intimate COVID-safe discussion with the folks in our community who will be affected by these policy changes. Please know that PAL's doors are open to host such a conversation. Through PAL's consistent presence in the community, We've earned the trust of our families, and we're well positioned to host a genuine conversation that should be able to provide useful and actionable insights. We want the council to know that, and the community to know, that the Redwood City Police Department has supported PAL in financial, managerial, and volunteer efforts since our chapter's founding in 1995. Many recommendations from the community forums encouraging the police department to engage the community in social, athletic, and educational activities are already happening at PAL. The Redwood City PAL provides after-school education and enrichment activities for 200 kids per year, including sports activities such as Junior Giants baseball, the first tee, and after-school sports. We provide healthy lifestyles and education to help kids and their families make good decisions regarding food selection and preparation. And we want to make sure that the city knows our door is open to help.
Thank you, John. Next speaker is Lizette, and then Livy Beja.
Hi, I'm Lisa Espinosa Garnica. I'm the candidate for Redwood City in District 3, and I wanted to talk about the staff report. Currently, the ad hoc committee, even after this presentation, after these couple presentations, none of the 8 points of desire for does not include descoping or defunding the police when it was the most important response for residents. The research by PCRC even describes how PCRC describes how about 75% of people would not care if the police were unfunded or defunded. And about 62 people said they were concerned and wanted defunding and descoping. This current initiative with the pilot program, we certainly need more than just one. And you aren't even descoping the police in that by letting police ride along with the mental health. The point is to have people that aren't armed and aren't ready to, or aren't able to arrest someone on site. That is being able to escalate. So the issues that we also see is that you're ignoring the Stanford report that also suggests that de-escalation training is insufficient and has little to no effect on the number of aggressive incidents in the department. Yet you're trying to do this with our police. Also, there's not enough with all this data that we have. You're saying stuff in the staff report that's misleading as well. Like, we're going to clarify what the SRO is. Like, we know what the SRO is. The point of having an SRO is to have cops on campus to police children. You're making policing a positive thing when being policed is never associated with positivity. It's always associated with being taken to jail for something you've done wrong, and you're always kept in a system as a result of policing. So what we need to talk about is we don't need police working with ICE. You're saying that the department will provide emergency support for ICE officers working within the city. And yeah.
Thank you, Lizette. Thank you. My next speaker is Livy Beja, and then Johanna Rasmussen.
Thank you, City Council. I'm so sorry. I thought I would have 3 minutes. I'm going to talk quite fast. Thank you all so much for participating in all of these conversations with us over the past couple of months. And I want to say a special thank you to PCRC and the Stanford researchers. But I'm here tonight to kind of express my confusion as to why the city would pay an independent contractor to conduct listening sessions with the community, where the community's most mentioned interest was defunding or descoping the police. But the city did not directly respond to this request and rather spent 9 pages of the staff report explaining how the city was addressing concerns through police programs, which as listed out, were in their own right varying degrees of racist. For example, the city proudly still cooperates with ICE. We don't need welcoming cities if they aren't also sanctuary cities. The city's suggestion that they are doing so much to address racism is confusing to me, because if the programs the city is already doing were working, we wouldn't be here in the first place. I personally have no trust in RCPD. It's not that we don't know about the services, it's that we don't think that they are working. I'm also confused as to why, when we ask for all traffic enforcement, homelessness services, and mental health wellness checks to be transferred from police to civilians and social workers, the city's proposal is limited to bringing in what amounts to 1 FTE of a county social worker's time to go out on calls with police, which is not at all like the cahoots model that we brought up as the ideal model in every single meeting that I've attended on this subject. To be clear about one thing I'm not confused about is that the goal of the work plan needs to explicitly be to proactively examine and dismantle racism in the city's institutions and stop government forces from killing and harming people in our community and contributing to the racist carceral state. While I support the basic principles of the equity work plan, it risks losing point in bureaucracy and symbolic gestures, and I do not see it as fully reflective of exhaustively addressing the reported desires of the community, nor reflective of the Stanford report. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Johanna Rasmussen and then Kati Teague.
Good evening. On September 10th, VOCA did a poll, and 68% of residents reported back that they were not aware that the listening sessions were taking place. That was a number that I found to be surprising. While making statements and proclamations and declarations are nice, they do very little in and of themselves to increase transparency, communication, independent oversight, or to build trust within our community. Section 1 of the staff report, Desire for City to Consider Alternative Models for Policing, lists 11 items. 10 of the 11 are done by one member of our police department. Policing is absolutely essential, and we can do more to build and promote trust by prioritizing the programs and services we currently provide, to include more than one member of the police department working on those. We need to expand community policing, and we need to hire from within our community so our police force better reflects our community. I believe that we can do more. I believe our community deserves it, and I believe our police officers deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Kati Teague and then Clara Jackal.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. So the city's recommendations I found kind of alarming and tone deaf. I heard over and over again calls for defunding and descoping the police in the hopes that people would have unarmed resources. For example, homeless and mentally ill people would not interact with someone in a uniform with a badge and a gun and a taser and the power to take them off to a cage somewhere. So I find the idea that we send a mental health care professional along with police during a crisis was sort of a blatant disregard for what we were actually asking for as a community, which was something like the cahoots model. I think it's a little disingenuous or very disingenuous to compare this recommendation with the cahoots model. So I'd like to second everything that everyone has said about defunding and descoping and pouring money into community services. I would also like real quick to bring up the work of Dr. Frank Dobbin at Harvard. A paper came out in 2018 by him about how diversity training does not work, and research dating back to the 1930s suggests that anti-bias training doesn't work. It doesn't alter behavior and it doesn't reduce bias. And that is easily accessible research, and I just wish that we as a community would quit banging our heads into a wall about a solution that sounds good on paper, but the research doesn't actually indicate that it works. I just did not feel that the city's reaction showed evidence of deep listening, and I hope that we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Clara Jackal and then Maria Rutenberg. Clara? Clara, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to start by saying that I want to second the comments made by Lisette, Livy, and Kati. And I have heard several times the claim made that police are needed to keep the community safe, but actually the opposite is true. Far from improving public safety, having armed officers always increases the risk to community members in an encounter with the police. So we don't want additional programs to add more community contacts with police. In a failed attempt to build trust, that trust will always be undermined by an unequal power dynamic with the presence of weapons and the police authorization from the government to use force against us. I think that there was a mention made of trying to assess the community trust level. I think we're already at the worst trust level. We need to take the strongest oversight measures. And I personally call, and again, as many people have referenced, there were repeated requests for this in the listening sessions in the PCRC report. We call for decreased interactions with police, for as many services as possible to be performed by other staff. That includes removing the school resource officer, having no support whatsoever for ICE, sending unarmed staff to connect with unhoused residents, having mental health clinicians replace rather than assist police in responding to mental health crisis calls, and transferring as many other routine service types to unarmed service officers as possible. It is in order to fund these different types of staff and services that we call for the police budget to be decreased. So I urge you to please reconsider the equity work plan and take Redwood City in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Maria Rutenberg and then Brandon Enriquez.
Hi, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for letting me speak. I would like to speak on behalf of the small business owners because I manage 26 properties in Redwood City. And I just want to tell you that in the last 4 months, the level of crime and lawlessness increased exponentially. In fact, we had more burglaries, graffitis, homeless people defecating in front of customers than I would say in the last 5 years combined. And that has become a real problem, and it's a huge cost to the small business owners who are actually suffering. So all this dialogue is great, but I want to see what exactly has been done to provide for increased safety and increased aesthetics, because these two goals are actually parts of the 7-point plan adopted by City Council in January of this year. And as of right now, I haven't seen a single thing that City Council did in the last 4 months to further these goals. So it would be nice if you guys address these issues and help a business community who has been suffering tremendously in the last 4 months because of COVID. And now they also have to pay for additional safety and additional patrolling because police is basically has been told to stand down and not to deal with this. I physically had to deal with the number of homeless people and try to get rid of them myself because police, unfortunately, while willing to help, cannot do much about this. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Brandon Enriquez and then Nicholas Kareem Abraham.
Hello, City Council. Thank you for your time and for having me. I just want to say that I agree that y'all are not doing enough to reduce crime. And I can give you some suggestions on how the police and the council can reduce crime. So crime is caused by poverty, and the police does not prevent crime. They actually punish it. So if you want to reduce crime, then I suggest that we should de-scope the police and give resources to alleviate poverty and to relieve poverty and to relieve the needs that folks that leads to folks to resort to crime. And I appreciate the RCPD and Chief Mollahan wanting to do more for the community. However, one way that can truly do more for the community and to reduce police brutality is for the police to do less. We do not need armed police to be around our children, to be basically service workers, when we could just pay service workers and have them do the work. Why do we have to raise the police budget, and why do we have to have the police do all these things that they're not trained to do? And even if they are trained, they have weapons and they're notoriously known to abuse their power as law enforcers. And also, the police should not be a part of the conversation about the problems with the police. And that is one huge complaint I had about the listening sessions. I would recommend that if you were to have listening sessions again, that you would actually listen to us and to hear our recommendations and include that in your report, because frankly, there is very little that is recommended that we actually want.
Thank you. My next speaker is Nicholas Kareem Abraham, and then Ian W.
Yes. Hello. I'd just like to say generally first that I think it's important to talk about the fact that addressing systemic racism means dismantling racist systems and building new ones. That's really what we're talking about here. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as we move forward. I want to make a couple specific comments on two of the elements of the proposals. The first one, which has been, I'm echoing what some other people have said already. I'm really concerned about the recommendations for mental health response, because when we're talking about cahoots as a model for that, we're talking about an autonomous mental health response team that is separate from the police department. When you're relying on the police department to respond to these mental health calls, you're one, giving them more power, which, in turn is in fact criminalizing people that are in mental health crises. And I would much prefer if we had a separate response team so that we have people that were really dedicated to responding to these crises correctly. Because I know that one of the biggest issues with police killings in Redwood City specifically, and San Mateo County more broadly, is police killings of people in mental health crises. And I think taking armed officers out of most of these situations would drastically improve things and make everyone safer. And then secondly, I was a little bit concerned about the wording of clarifying the role of the SRO at Sequoia, because, as Lisette mentioned, we know what the SRO does. And, I graduated from Sequoia a couple years ago. I never really felt safer having an SRO on campus. I felt much safer knowing about the resources we had on campus that actually kept people safe, such as the Teen Resource Center, such as counselors, such as really great teachers, which are unfortunately underpaid. So I think we should focus our energy on those types of resources that actually keep people safe, rather than having an armed officer going around on campus and often enforcing behavioral violations, sometimes with excessive force, and putting people in contact with the criminal justice system when they don't need to be. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Ian W. and then Linda.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the council for using video during this meeting. I think that really helps with engagement. Second, I want to support everything that Livy, Lisette, Kati, Clara, Brandon, and Nicholas have said in their comments. According to the Stanford report on the listening sessions, the number one request regarding policing was for defunding and descoping the police. However, the framing of the staff report significantly downplays this, and every time it was mentioned in tonight's meeting, it was coupled with comments that tried to deflect from actual policing issues and focus on other issues without reducing policing. And this carries forward into recommendations that were made as well. This unfortunately reinforces the broad concern, which was also expressed in the report, that the City Council would not take meaningful steps and would instead only focus on symbolic gestures. The police are not the appropriate tool for handling public services. We shouldn't be retraining police to do jobs that could be done better, safer, and less expensively by unarmed career professionals. We have to rethink how we spend our city's resources and direct funds away from the police department and into public services. We don't need to be spending $50 million and more a year on police, and social services shouldn't be conducted by armed officials. I know the council is reluctant to make major changes like this, and that you'd prefer to make smaller and less disruptive actions, like additional training or new use of force guidances, but study after study, as other speakers have mentioned, have shown that these minor tweaks make no real difference. Even setting up a citizens oversight committee, a step the council has not yet embraced, does not work because these committees don't typically have the tools necessary to force change, like subpoena power, the ability to discipline and fire officers. In fact, Charlottesville, Virginia was one of the several cities that established an oversight committee, and how did it turn out? This summer, members resigned from the committee because it wasn't able to affect real difference in the way that the police were conducting themselves. The ACLU is on record saying that the measures Redwood City is discussing don't have any meaningful impact. And so I'm asking the city to listen to what people are actually saying and start moving away from police and into public services.
Thank you, Ian. My next speaker is Linda and then Anna Loy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you all for turning on your cameras. It's really helpful for me to see and hear everybody. I wanted to echo the responses from Livy and Liz and Clara and Kathy and Brandon and Nicholas and Ian and all the folks before me speaking about defunding the police and about reducing interactions between the police and the residents. I also wanted to highlight again the PCRC poll results. When prompted in the poll with the question or the comment, the statement, I'm concerned that the city will reduce funding for the police, 77% of those polled responded that they were not concerned. So people were not concerned about reducing funding. When polled again, I am concerned the city will make symbolic gestures of change regarding systemic racism, 75% were concerned. And I am deeply concerned tonight. For those 68% that Johanna was saying that of residents who did not know about the PCRC listening sessions, I just wanted to share a few comments from the PCRC raw notes. It starts at page 18. One comment said there are some POC who have spoken but do not feel heard or feel muted. Before moving here, this person was aware of this idea of there being two Redwood City, white people would live in one area and Black and brown people would live in another. And this person knew about it before they moved here. So there's so many other comments here. One more was saying that boy students at this teacher's school would get stopped by police for fitting a description at 10 years old. We do not need police in school. We do not need to clarify SROs, and we need more support from the city council to descope and defund the police. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My next speaker is Anna Loy and then Lucy Burns.
Okay.
Anna Loy?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. All right, well, this is my very, very first time to weigh in on any of these issues, and I must say that I agree with much of what the last 10 or so speakers have said, and I really appreciate how articulate that they are. I am kind of disappointed at what I consider kind of a lot of really kind of vague ideas and very little real in-depth discussion of the defunding and descoping police and very concrete suggestions for that. Now, maybe they're in there somewhere, but I came in expecting to hear a lot about that issue, hoping that I would, and I did not get it. There was a very brief slide talking about the level of community trust in police, and it just kind of flashed on the screen and then it left, and there was no discussion of how ascertaining what that level of trust is, whether that's being done, and how that fits into this overall large picture. And I'm not going to take up any much more time, but I appreciate all the work that the council people have done, but I find a lot of it kind of unsatisfyingly vague and not enough focused on specific things for defunding and descoping police. And thank you very much.
Thank you. My next speaker is Lucy Burns and then Michael Solario.
Thank you, and I appreciate all of the hard work that has gone into this project. I want to agree with everyone who has spoken about the disconnect between the community's repeated requests for defunding the police and what it has presented in the staff report tonight. I hope the City Council will acknowledge this disconnect and address it in future meetings. I specifically wanted to speak about the suggested mental health pilot program. A key feature of the CAHOOTS program, which was mentioned in that slide, is that the police do not respond to a subset of calls that can be handled by mental health professionals. According to the Stanford report included as well, the CAHOOTS handles 20% of 911 calls while only costing 2% of the police budget, and this program required backup less than 1% of the time in 2019. Not only are they providing a better experience for their community, 0% chance of a police shooting if the police are not the responders, they are doing it at a significantly lower cost than the police if you consider the ratio of call volume to budget. The model you have proposed seems to add cost to the already significant police budget rather than reducing it. I also wanted to ask, how will mental health professionals alongside a police officer be able to effectively de-escalate situations in which police have specific training from which they cannot deviate? The mere presence of a weapon, we know, escalates these situations, and not to speak of the potential history of trauma from prior police interactions that may exist. The suggested pilot program fails to address the key aspect of cahoots. A November 2016 study published in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine estimated that 20% to 50% of fatal encounters with law enforcement involved an individual with a mental illness. The cahoots model demonstrates that these fatal encounters are not inevitable. I urge the city to choose to emulate models that have a proven track record of success. And I would add to that that there are very few examples of police reform that are successful.
Thank you very much. My next speaker is Michael Solario, and then call-in user 1.
Hi, my name is Michael Solorio, and I live and work in Redwood City. And first, I want to thank y'all for your commitment to racial justice. We're not going to be able to make change in the city without y'all's work towards racial justice. So I thank y'all for that. And after this wonderful presentation, I hope that y'all will make actions aligned with the values that the public has so clearly called for. That way we could feel confident about how well we have been listened to. I personally would, like so many people just before me suggested, that you adopt critical response teams with mental health professionals that operate separately from the police department. That'd be a great way to start by de-scoping our police. Many members of the undocumented community fear the police and will not call them. So if we have teams that respond to calls without the police, our immigrant community would be able to call them without fear of deportation for them or their family, and that would make our city a more welcoming city. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is call-in user 1, and then Samantha Maloa.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for taking my call. It's Marcelina Luna. And I like to say that I do agree with a lot of the previous speakers about addressing the information on the report from this evening agenda. And there's a lot of details in there that I don't believe the City Council is really willing or wanting to dig deep into it to create real change in our city. And we are really advocating for defunding the police and using that resource to our social services that we know the police is not trained to handle, and we could have a better city for everyone. You know, you created the listening sessions to get our feedback, and here is the feedback, and I feel like you're making it, you're romancing the stuff that was brought up that is very serious. And I really, my hope is that the city takes a really deeper look and create real change, since a lot of the issues that were brought up from the community are a direct impact of your decisions and your policies that you have voted for, whether it be housing, costs, budgets for the police that we do not agree with. So I just want to echo what the previous callers had said, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. My next speaker is Samantha Maloa, and then Bob Lee.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Samantha Maloa, and I'm a 10-year resident of Redwood City, born and raised in the Bay Area. I've been part of the social justice group in Redwood City as early as May of this year, and I would like to say that this is just the beginning. You have a group of people in Redwood City who are aligned and very passionate about seeing real change. And what we've been offered in this report so far is a watered down version of an opportunity to make substantial changes and show true leadership in the Bay Area Peninsula. I would say also that we live in a city where we have a jail and a courthouse, which means our city is already extra charged with high police presence and sheriff activity, and that our law enforcement use our exits as pit stops, which means that we have to be making extra efforts to make sure that policing on the east side of El Camino and the west side of El Camino is not seen as one side getting partnered with and one side being a suspect. And that's what the mentality is of your residents. And what I'm hearing tonight is that we need an upgrade. We need not just a watered down basic version of a pat on the head. We need real effort from the city and local leadership to go deeper. And so I just challenge you that we are really asking for something now, but as this mentality builds and grows, you have a group of passionate people that will not stop showing up to city council meetings, will not stop emailing local officials, and will not stop showing up at the square or other opportunities to raise our hand in alignment for social justice change. So I hope that you get used to hearing all of us often, because we will be back until we see actual change, and we'll keep challenging you to be a higher accountable city leadership that we believe that you can be. Thank you.
Thank you. My next speaker is Bob Lee, and then Vanessa.
Thank you, Mayor Howard, City Council members, and the PCRC for all of your work in everything that you're doing. I wanted to reiterate what a lot of my neighbors have been saying in terms of the responding to the responses that City Council is putting forward, noting that it does seem to not address, for example, defunding the police. And I wanted to make very clear from my perspective, this idea when we talk about defunding the police, and in the staff report, there was a lot of responses to how the City Council believes that they're responding to defunding the police or allowing for alternative service models of policing. And I just wanted to make clear that, when we talk about this, it's, as other people before me have said, that we want to take the policing out of it, as opposed to incorporating the police into many of these services and alternative models. Because if this is already being done within Redwood City, then it's clear from the community's response that what's already being done is not what the community is looking for. And I think that's really important, because whenever we talk about what's already being done in terms of community policing, in terms of the services already being partnered, the police is already being partnered with other organizations, the community isn't feeling that in terms of feeling the safety, in terms of feeling that it's for the community. And I just wanted to share a really quick story of how last night I was just walking my dog in our community, in our neighborhood, and there was a police patrol car kind of just going around the neighborhood and flashing the flashlights around different homes, and it happened to flash on me for a second, and my heart skipped a beat. And I wasn't sure if the police was looking for me. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just walking my dog. And that's how I believe many of my neighbors feel every day. So thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. My next speaker is Vanessa, and then Nisha Masharani.
Hello. Hi, City Council. I really appreciate seeing everybody's faces as they were speaking today, giving their presentations. I also wanted to say hello to all of the other unknown community members who are on this call, who have the best interests of Redwood City in their minds. I still don't know who they are, but I just wanted to say hello. So we all just viewed the same charts from the PCRC, and it was obvious to me that the majority of people who were attending the listening sessions want to see the police defunded. This is not reflected in the staff report as it stands right now. I don't know if there are any plans to change the staff report or like how this will impact your budget decisions at the end of October, but I feel like the plan that was just presented is a shell of what it could be in terms of actionable items that would protect our neighbors of color and people who need to be like, who are targeted by the police most often. Yeah, I feel like the City Council has been presented with so much information from so many well-educated and informed members of the community who are invested in the protection of their neighbors, and the City Council has not really inputted what they might have learned from these conversations into the staff report, and I feel like that isn't right. I also just wanted to point out really quickly that, well, no, never mind. I don't have time for that. Thank you so much for letting me comment.
Thank you. My next speaker is Nisha Masharani and then B. Beekman.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, my name is Nisha Masharani and I'm a resident of Redwood City. I'm generally quite disappointed by the recommendations in the staff report. In particular, I'm really disappointed by the city's clear lack of listening that so many previous speakers have called out. Of the 8 categories of feedback the staff report calls out, none accurately reflect the top feedback from the PCRC listening sessions, which was de-scope/defund the police. And I think many folks have pointed that out already. I'm really baffled that the city would put so much time, effort, and emphasis into, quote, listening, only to just ignore what residents say. Beyond that, I think, the staff report makes a bunch of recommendations around equity and public safety. And I think it's very clear that none of the staff report's recommendations actually reflect, again, the most common piece of feedback that PCRC heard in the listening sessions, which was de-scope and defund the police. This first recommendation around having mental health clinicians partner with police officers, I think many folks have kind of already pointed out some of the problems here. I just wanted to point out that this isn't coming from the city, it's coming from the county. So this is a thing that the city is taking credit for, but it doesn't actually reduce the scope or funding of the police, and B, it's not something the city is doing. Now, obviously, this stuff is really difficult and takes time, which is why the Stanford report lays out a clear roadmap for how to reimagine public safety. The report has this 5-step plan that it recommends cities. However, the staff report's recommendations reflect none of these recommended steps. Lastly, I just want to point out that the PCRC report notes that 75% of participants were worried that the city will only take symbolic action or make minimal gestures of change regarding systemic racism. Right now, it seems pretty clear that that's what's happening. Us residents have been really clear about what we want, but luckily it's not too late. You guys have an opportunity to make real systemic change in Redwood City, but following the recommendations in this staff report will not accomplish that admirable goal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. My next speaker is B. Beekman and then Caltrain user.
Hi, thank you. Blair Beekman here. I was originally from the San Mateo area. Now I'm living in San Jose Fremont area. I don't have so much knowledge on these issues, but thank you for your efforts that you're making to try to address racial equity and the future policing. Most Bay Area cities are trying to deal with the same issues, often in the same ways, and you've been accused of being a little too light. I'm a little light myself, and I hope it's from that lightness of thought that it can allow yourselves to be open to really hear really important ideas right now. And how to select actually those ideas, I don't know what that entails, but you're hearing something. I think you're prepared to hear something very deep at this time, and I hope you can learn. I think we're at a time, if nothing else, to be open how to make those adjustments at this time. I think that's part of the major change we can be going through right now, is to really make important adjustments when needed. And that's what I'm hopeful for. And for my own self, I work towards the ideas of an open accountability with open public policies with technology, surveillance, and data collection for local communities. It's from the ACLU originally, and it's a way that everyday community and its local government can work together to create their technology policies. And it's really, it makes things open, accountable, and it develops trust, good community practices. Joe Simidian, the supervisor from the Palo Alto area, Santa Clara County supervisor, he initiated some really important beginning work for Santa Clara County that I recommend, that I think is sort of transformational, and it can address a number of issues for a city. So I invite you to look into that as part of the parts of the solution. And the ideas of a peer review for policing, that's another problem solver, I think, that I think many Bay Area communities should be talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My next speaker is Caltrain user and then Brett Frangipani.
Good evening, Mayor Howard and Redwood City. I'm John, a regular Caltrain user. I always take Caltrain to the Millbay station to connect to San Francisco and to go to downtown San Francisco. No driving, no parking, quality service, and with a discount fare, less than $10 for me. However, whereas I'm quite satisfied with Caltrain service as a user, the honest truth is Caltrain operates under a dysfunctional governance structure and has significant cost management issues. Therefore, vote no on the proposed sales tax hike in Measure RR. The Joint Powers Board involves 7 public agencies with competing and conflicting priorities, and Caltrain is not operating with effective cost controls. In fact, with the recent steep decline in ridership, Caltrain has had no layoffs because they're using federal handouts under the CARES Act to keep people on the payroll. So regardless of another funding source for Caltrain, like a sales tax, Caltrain has not managed their costs. And vote no on Measure RR. There could be some alternative governance structure and operation for Caltrain, but Measure RR is a bad deal for taxpayers. There's no rational basis for taxing merchants and their customers, their consumers, to subsidize what is actually a bankrupt railroad. So there could be an alternative for Caltrain, but it should not be through a sales tax. Vote no on Measure RR.
Thank you. My next speaker is Brett Frangipani. Did I correctly pronounce your name, sir?
Yes, that's correct. Thanks, Mayor Howard. And I'd like to thank the city for exploring these issues. However, I'd have to agree with many of the previous speakers, including Lizette, Libby, Brandon, Vanessa, Nisha, and many others about defunding and descoping the police. I'm concerned about why the city hasn't moved toward defunding or descoping the police when the listening sessions and public comments show that there's demand for this from our residents. We've repeatedly referenced research that shows that bias training, body cameras, and other reforms don't work. But actually that investing in social services and non-police institutions can really improve public safety. We've also pointed to other cities such as Eugene with its non-police CAHOOTS program and Berkeley with its program to staff traffic stops with non-police staff. So this raises some kind of difficult and unfortunate questions. Why isn't the city recommending measures to descope or defund the police? What are the priorities of the city? Who is the city listening to? At best, there's a lack of transparency around the decisions. But we also know that many of the members of the council have received funding from law enforcement organizations. So I would like to ask you again to heed the desires of the community and the successes of our neighboring cities and the research of academics on the subject of defunding and descoping the police. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. And my last speaker is Amanda Doherty.
Hello, good evening, Mayor Howard, council members, City Manager Diaz, and all my neighbors. I'd like to thank PCRC for their very thorough process of listening. I would like to also thank the subcommittee for recommending that we continue this work in a permanent committee because clearly these recommendations do not reflect the will of the public and we have a lot more work to do. In fact, rather than a committee, I would like to see you commit to this work, not just in words, but in actions, by forming a permanent commission on racial equity, which would have the benefit of including voices of the community as well as the city council. Unfortunately, I do have to agree with numerous previous speakers that this report is a demonstration of why we do not trust the city government nor the RCPD. The number one ask of residents in the listening sessions was to de-scope the police. We do not want police in schools, coaching children's sports, playing psychologist or social worker or homeless advocate. Thank you to Vice Mayor Major for acknowledging the widespread public support for our CAHOOTS model of mental health response. But CAHOOTS does not include police. I urge you to reject this county pilot, which is not sufficient nor appropriate for our city. We do not want men with guns approaching our residents who are in mental health crisis, and I'm not sure how much clearer we can all say it. I do appreciate City Manager Diaz acknowledging that we need to do better with data and transparency. That is definitely evident in this staff report. A lot of analysis of public opinion here, but I see no data regarding our police department, which I think we really need to know, what needs to change. We need some data. Thanks again for your time, and I hope you'll consider a permanent commission on racial equity.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to thank everyone who came this evening and all of you for your comments. All public speakers can stay on the Zoom call or continue to follow the meeting through the live broadcast, either on the city's website at www.redwoodcity.org or on cable television on local channel 26, Comcast channel 27, or AT&T UVerse channel 99. At this time, we're going to have council discussion. There are 3 questions up on the screen. Do you have questions for the committee or staff about their outreach and research? Do you have questions for PCRC about the dialogue sessions? And do you support the concept of an equity work plan focused on public safety, all other city services, and in the community as a whole? So I open it now for council discussion. And I'd like to know who would like to begin the conversation or have a question. It's a lot to take in this evening. We'll start with Council Member Hale.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, members of the public who took the time to attend, to write in, to read the staff report. And a special thanks to our committee members. Having served on a pretty intense ad hoc committee, I know what a huge time commitment that is. To our mayor, vice mayor, and to Councilwoman Aguirre. I really do appreciate that. And then a big thanks to our staff. I know that amidst the layer cake of crises our city and our community are experiencing, that you prioritize this work, which is a real reflection of your commitment to acting on community feedback. I wanted to start with a few questions. We'll try to be as quick as possible because we want to hear from everyone. And these are clarifications. So did the concept of the CAHOOTS model came up several times. Did the committee meet with anyone familiar with the CAHOOTS model, sort of intimately familiar? And how does it compare to what we're doing? And is our pilot additive or replacing? Because I did get the sense hearing from community members that they were expecting this to be a full replacement. So if someone could speak to that, that'd be great.
That's a good question. I'll ask our city manager if she could start the conversation on that one. Thank you.
Yes, I'll be happy to start, and then also ask Chief Mulholland to provide more details. So we did actually at a staff level, the full committee, but staff did meet with a current staff member at CAHOOTS in conjunction with the other Mid-Peninsula cities who were working with Stanford. So we did have the opportunity to talk with the current administrator there. And one of the things that I think is important that I learned out of that discussion was the CAHOOTS model was not set up as a defunding mechanism. It was set up to meet community needs, and it's been over 30 years, so it has certainly evolved over time. So it did come, I think, from a different place than maybe is considered at this time. And as we understand it, it is one of multiple models. There are a few different ways that this is being approached in different communities. So at a city level, we approached the county health department about their willingness to work with us on this because they're the ones who currently employ mental health professionals. That's not part of our bread and butter. We don't do that routinely. And in this county, we do a lot of partnership work to be effective in taking on things that are really not practical for a city of our size to take on alone. So we, along with city representatives for San Mateo and South San Francisco at first, and now later Daly City, approached the county about the opportunity to partner together on a pilot program with guidance from Stanford to help us in figuring out what the right measurements are to assess the potential from the start, and then also over time to see where the impact is. And the value of a, excuse me, of a pilot being that it gives us the chance to make adjustments over time, which is our understanding of what has happened in other communities. They haven't necessarily ended up in the same place they started. So with that long introduction, maybe I'll ask Chief to share a little bit more about where we're at in the development. It's not finalized at this point.
Can I just interject really quick, because I want to make sure one piece of my question gets answered, which is just the additive or the replacement part and how it works with PD and cahoots. This would be helpful to clarify.
So we're in the process of firming up the budget recommendations for the end of October for the City Council to consider. And one of the things that I'm been doing over time is when we have special pilot initiatives, we typically call those out in a special section of the budget. So it's part of general fund funding, and it's something that gives us the chance to track when we're putting in money toward important, meaningful initiatives. So I would see this program will fit in that category. It'll be similar to call outs that you see related to, say, transition plan for Americans with Disabilities Act access and other things that have a limited period. In terms of the overall department funding, all of the city departments are going to be subject to budget reductions in this year because of our reduced finances. The final amount of that is still under discussion. And I would say that this entire fiscal year is a transition year as we look at how do we reduce our costs citywide, how do we adjust our services citywide over time to reflect both changing community needs as well as significantly lower than expected revenues. So we have many months ahead of figuring out those changing services, and they're not going to be final with all of that for the police department or for any department at the end of this month.
And Chief, did you have something to add as well?
Yes, I would like to add just a quick update on the project. We've held our initial meetings. We put together the overall framework of what we think, and when I say we, I'm referring to the chiefs of police from the city of San Mateo, the city of South San Francisco, and now the chief of the Daly City Police Department. So we put together a general framework and concept of what we think this model would look like. About a week and a half or a week ago, we met with a researcher from Stanford, the chiefs did, to start sharing ideas and data collection, and give her some general information to start working with. And very soon, I believe at the end of this week or early next week, we'll have a follow-up meeting to now hear feedback from her on suggested ideas moving forward, what success would look like, how the program would be further framed based upon experiences that she's been able to draw from her research, and then further discussion how we as a chief can continue to move forward with the timeline to ideally have something in place after the first of the year.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes, okay. I think, Melissa, you actually answered my second question, which was how did the opportunity to pilot come about? Did we approach the county? It sounds like we did actually approach the county. So that's interesting. And then several commenters mentioned the disconnect between what they had heard at the listening sessions and what was presented today around the requests that were made to defund the police. So I don't know if staff wants to speak to that or if PCRC wants to speak to that perception gap.
Well, if I may, I'd share a few thoughts on that, but invite maybe the committee to comment on that as well. So I think one of the things that we tried to convey, and clearly not very well in the written report, is the work that PCRC did was really important and really valuable. And it was one of several layers of communications that the city has had in the last several months. Certainly, we heard really clearly in those meetings about interest in changing what police do and how they do that and how they're funded. There's no question that we heard that in those settings. But there were other settings and other meetings and other discussions and other feedback that the city council has heard at an individual level and at a group level over time. So I don't think it would be fair to characterize the findings out of the PCRC discussion as the only or cumulative feedback. There was additional feedback provided in other forums.
I'd like to add, though, also budget decisions are going to be tough, and we're going to do them at the end of October. This was an opportunity for us to address the issue around the police department and what we were willing to do moving forward, how we're going to pay for these things, and what each department, including the police department, will need to do the job that we're asking them to do is going to be discussed in October. Tonight was a chance for us to gather together and talk about all the information that we have gathered and see and get direction from the council as well as the community. I did want to ask a clarifying question based on what Councilmember Hale was asking about cahoots. I did some research and I'd like to know if it's correct. You said that cahoots is a 30-year-old model, but there are also many models out there. That their mission was not created to defund the police, but it is my understanding that cahoots work with the police in dangerous situations to secure the premises before mental health take over and do what they need to do. I'd like to know if that's correct, if the information that I received, if that's your understanding also on how the model works. They don't send mental health into a situation without the area being secured.
Maybe we'll tag team again on this with the chief, but yes, our understanding from our discussions with representatives at cahoots are, first, it starts at the level of a call coming into dispatch. So the dispatchers are trained in order to assess with the call that they're receiving, is that something that should go to the police department or to emergency medical? And once either of those groups interacts with the person or the situation, they can then be, either continue with the providers through cahoots or they can continue through the police, but it can take different routes. Also, with a cahoots model, there are multiple people. It is a team of people responding to each call. And one of the things that we're still analyzing and don't have a full report for you at this point is the volume of calls that are handled by those teams, whether that volume in any way looks like the volume of calls we have. So for example, do we have enough calls to justify a 3-person team that's available 24/7? Our sense is we don't. That's why we're looking at a partnership model and something that's different from exactly that model in that region. But I'd ask the chief if he has any more he would like to share about that.
Your assessment is absolutely correct. There is a triage that takes place at the communication center when the call comes in, and then the decision is made as to who is going to respond to that. But it could very easily switch back and forth, whether it's a law enforcement response or who's only response based upon any sense of crisis or urgency that's taking place on the call. So there is a degree of adaptability that takes place, and oftentimes there may be a need for not to have both entities there, and other times there's a need very much so to have them both there, whether it's to provide a sense of security to those that are responding or some measure of stability, and then allow the mental health professional to then take over that additional de-escalation and then an assessment for services that need to be provided.
Thank you very much, Chief, and thank you, Ms. Diaz. Councilmember Hale, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify because you asked an excellent question.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. It was helpful to hear the additional context from the city manager. Let's see, there was a question, the concept of a commission on racial equity was raised by several commenters. I wanted to hear from the committee, was that something that you had explored in addition to the creation of a council committee? And also, was the council committee an ad hoc or is that permanent?
So
well,
the committee was on my slide, so I'm happy to answer, but go ahead, Mayor, if you prefer.
No, I defer to you. Go ahead.
So just on the committee, the idea is that it would be a permanent subcommittee of the council. And so as such, that those committees, as you know, council member, but for the public, those committees are noticed meetings and they are open for people to come and testify and listen to the committee discussion. So it's a different structure than we have right now with the ad hoc. We haven't discussed timing, as I think we're all very well aware. There is an election coming up, so it may be that we want to have that creation afterwards. I don't know, but just something for us to consider. On the concept of a racial equity commission, we didn't have any discussions about that. However, as you saw the mayor present in her first slide, the idea is to develop a racial equity plan. And so in my opinion, I think that's something that could be discussed as part of a racial equity plan.
Okay.
My personal question would be, do we want a racial equity commission? Another suggestion that we heard from one of the leaders and organizers of the Black Lives Matter protests was the idea of a commission more focused on the policing aspects, similar to what the council subcommittee would do. So I think that's a question still to be answered. Which do you do both? Do you do, how would that, what might that look like? So does that answer,
Yeah,
help?
it does. No, that does. That's helpful. So, and then on the last question, I'll just give my feedback so I can move along on the, so I've asked the questions. And so then the last question on the slide here, Mayor, just feedback on the concept of the equity plan is, for the first pillar, equity and public safety, I really like this park model for determining levels of oversight. Across the board, I was really impressed by the Stanford research, and I feel that that's something that we should really be leveraging. I also believe culture is a really powerful tool for change, and I know that that is not often brought up by members of the public, but having led large organizations myself, I mean, culture is really, it's really what sets the tone. And I believe that the research presented on slides 7 to 12 of the research really could help us figure out what that model looks like and what it is, what are we solving for? So I'd love to see that work happen. Equity in all city services. I'm really interested in understanding how this would translate for our BCCs. We have not yet moved to a model with our boards and commissions, sorry for the public, boards and commissions, that really addresses that, though we put it into our proclamation around equity. So I think this is now the opportunity to determine how we could action that. Third, actions to enhance equity in the community. I'd like to see us sharing these findings with the school districts that were mentioned, if that's not already planned or hasn't already happened, and so that they could potentially be actually included in the plan. I am curious about what is meant by clarifying the SRO well. I know a couple members of the public asked that. That was a question I had. And I personally believe that's a conversation that the school district should help to drive, because it's a need that they ask for and that we fulfill. So I think it's important for them to help drive that conversation, because that's really their domain. And then on this notion of a commission on racial equity, I do like this idea. I would be really mindful of staff time, but if we're already going to have a council committee, I think that it could be similar to our ad hoc on safe parking, where we worked closely with a board, a commission, the HHCC, together with council. And I just felt like that really accelerated our ability to move fast and to solve problems. So I'm open to that. The one thing that was missing for me from this plan that I'll throw out there for anyone else who wants to weigh in is what showed up in the PCRC sessions, which is cost of living and housing. And the 2 sessions that I attended, that was actually the main topic in the breakout groups that I was in. And I know we've already made housing the #1 issue for our strategic plan, but we really haven't clarified it completely through an equity lens. So I'd love to see housing have an equity model that explores what the legacy of segregation is in zoning and what could be a plan to correct for that, since it was voiced so frequently. And it was also in our citywide communications plan. The #1 issue for folks was housing. So that's all for my questions and my comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Hale. My next speaker, Councilmember Reddy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Councilmember Hale, for those great questions. I actually have no questions. I agree that the session, the PCRC session I attended, also the overwhelming comments had to do with inequity in education and housing and food insecurity. So I just wanted to preface my remarks with that comment that I so appreciate the comments that have been made and the residents who have been coming and talking about with passion their feelings about the police and just to remind us that this is not just about police. This is about inequity issues that are societal and that they're. And so I'm really glad that we're looking at all of our decisions, or we're proposing looking at all of our decisions through an equity lens, because that to me really will help us become a better, more responsive community. So my comments, thank you to the Council Ad Hoc Committee and PCRC for your amazing work. This is really, I love the report. The PCRC report was very thorough, and to staff for the extremely thorough staff report that accompanied tonight's agenda. In order to adequately plan where we're going, it's really important to know where we're coming from. And so I thank the chief and others for giving us that lens of what we have been doing and how we have been serving the community. I think that was, for me, extremely valuable as I'm talking to residents to talk about the many services that we have been providing. I'm proud of where we have where we're coming from, and thankfully, this is not Minneapolis or Louisville. We're having a conversation about police violence and racial bias. It's a huge, difficult conversation to have. This is Redwood City, where we already have a high standard for police conduct. We are part of that national conversation, though, and I'm grateful and impressed by the number of mostly white residents who have come forward to say they will not be silent. We must not be silent. We are very much a part of this conversation, and rethinking how our police serve this community and racial equity in general will continue to be part of this conversation. The recommendations being made tonight may not be going as far as some would like, but I, as one council member, appreciate this beginning. I learned last year when I thought initiating a safe parking program couldn't possibly take more than a couple of months, that this ship does not turn on a dime. In order to create something lasting and effective, all stakeholders need to come to the table and all ideas need to be thoroughly vetted. In addition to being cautious about not moving as quickly as some would like, excuse me, I'd also like to caution residents to seek the full story when being confronted with controversial messages. A video was recently circulated about a young woman who was arrested while participating in a counter protest in Redwood City. This young woman and her colleagues came from outside the area, were not part of the peaceful counter protests in which local residents participated. They sadly used the "make good trouble" saying of the truly heroic John Lewis to justify their intent to cause property damage with spray paint and tools intended for breaking windows. Her colleagues started filming just at the right moment to give the impression that she was the victim and not the aggressor. Our officers acted with calm and poise to protect residents and ensure the rally remained nonviolent. I support these recommendations and urge a report back so that we can assess next steps including the requested Community Oversight Committee. Thank you again to all for all the wonderful work that you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman Reddy. Appreciate your comments. Councilmember Borgens?
Thank you, Mayor Howard. And I also want to give my just strong thank you to this committee and the staff that worked so hard on this report. I do have a couple of questions. First, I'd like to agree with Councilmember Hale that I really do believe that we need to share this report with the school districts and bring them on board. We did hear many of the sessions I sat in. There were some real issues dealing around school equity. And I really think it's a great opportunity for us as a city council and then the elected bodies of our school boards come together and have these conversations also. And you know, let them know what we've heard. I think our PCRC report would be a great start for that. And we can help them through this process also. I do have a question. I'm not sure what part of the committee it would be, but I heard our chief Mulholland say it starts at a dispatch level. The CAHOOTS model, it started at a dispatch level. Sounds to me like there's another level of training here. So could you walk me through that process? The call comes in, what type of training is different from what they get today?
Are you referring to the CAHOOTS model or the model that
Well, I would be referring, I'm sorry, Chief, referring to any program we might have that would make that decision to either send a mental health versus a standardized police uniform personnel?
Yes, absolutely. Aside from the typical vetting process that would have to take place in order for someone to have access to confidential systems and files here at the police department, that person would also have to be properly trained in procedures that would be relevant to responding to calls for service involving somebody in mental health crisis. But we would, the ideal candidate, if you will, would be somebody that would already have a background, whether it's in family therapy or a medical background that would assist in their response to the calls, or some other professional certification that would take place. And we would rely upon the county health officials to make sure that those requirements were properly vetted and they would meet the criteria that would be appropriate for someone that's working in a field situation. In addition to that, there would also have to be familiarity with some police practices, familiarity with police personnel. And there would be a comfort level that would have to be developed there also, because the mental health professional would be working with a member of the police department. And though they may respond in their own vehicle to go out to that call, at some point the potential is there for the two to be married up on the call for service. So we would work, and during their downtime, we would also look to the professionals to be able to provide updated training to police department employees to ensure that the latest trends or practices that they're learning about from their side of the house is then passed on to law enforcement personnel. So we would envision quite a bit of ongoing training that's taking place. We would envision familiarity in some of our practices, our familiarity with what they do, and then also some of that basic procedures for being able to handle an incoming call and driving out to a site and how to remain safe while doing so.
Great, thank you. That just sounds like there's a whole nother level that we really need to consider as we move forward. And so I actually like the phrase someone said tonight, challenging us to look at how we do things in a different way. I think it's important that we accept this challenge. So I did have another question for PCRC, or maybe even our staff. We've heard a few times tonight from speakers that said there were many who had not heard about our outreach. that we were having these outreach. And PCR, you do an amazing job getting the word out there and bringing your organization to where people are. What would you suggest that we need to do possibly different or better in getting the word out to those who we're hearing are not getting involved because they didn't know about it? Is there a suggestion here?
So I wonder if we might actually call on PCRC for their feedback.
Yeah.
Sure. You know, it was extremely difficult to do outreach for this project, and it wasn't because the residents weren't receptive. It was because outreach is just difficult under the circumstances. I think for future, it might take more than just PCRC, but also to try and leverage other partnerships. There are a lot of competing priorities right now for organizations, as well as different programs and county efforts. But I know that this was a very important topic for the residents that we were able to engage with. I also think that another way is to really work more closer with our faith community. Although in the last few months, or actually last 5 months, there haven't been in-person church services, but a lot of those church leaders still have a lot of access to the members of their congregations. And so we were able to tap into a few of them who are still doing work, whether it's they're ministering over Zoom or over phone, or still conducting food distribution and other things like that, which we were able to utilize. But I think that partnership is a very important voice to be able to work with and to collaborate with and to engage more community members. And then there's just a lot of the communities of color and other communities that don't necessarily participate in city council meetings. Their voice is just as important as those that we've heard tonight, but really reaching them has been very difficult. And so working with other partnerships and organizations, we've had numerous phone calls with different individuals who are leading different efforts to try and get them to also engage and to bring others with them to the listening sessions. So it really is going to take sort of a collective approach to really outreach to everyone to ensure that we have more voices at the table.
Melissa, thank you. Thank you for that response, because you did an amazing job in such a short amount of time for the information that you gathered, and I truly appreciate that. But when I hear that we miss a point, and I truly do respect and agree with you to reach out to our faith-based community, because it is where a lot of us get our information, especially now during COVID, where we really can't get out and engage. These conversations are not going to stop. This was the start of a long process. But thank you for that, because I'm not trying to say you didn't do a great job. I'm just asking, what do we need to do moving forward to make it even better? So I really appreciate your response. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so looking at the questions, I've asked those two questions there, and I absolutely do support the concept of the equity work plan. I would ask that as we move forward, we look at separating the two. Let's see if I can find where it was. One that is racial equity. I want the racial equity piece for a committee to be separate from our discussion on any type of police reform. I think that is a broader based conversation that we can have in our community. And it will never get watered down, but I really think the stronger piece right now that everybody wants to talk about is how we defund or descope. I do not support the word defund. I have gone on record across the board saying that, but I do support a revisit on how we do provide the services to our community and what that looks like. And I clearly hear that that's what our chief and our staff and the rest of my colleagues have been working towards and working on. And so I would like to see if possibly we could keep those two separate. I also would like to support moving forward that we do create a permanent committee as we move forward with the small steps of the short-term goals right now going into the long-term, that we actually do create a committee, much like our boards and commissions, where a city council representative could sit on that commission. It would be a board or commission of community members, and we would have a seat at the table as a liaison to the council. So I think it's a concept worth talking about and looking forward, but I think the committee did an outstanding job in a short amount of time for what we have. And I thank you for the in-depth and the really ready for the deep dive. And it starts with these steps. So I thank you for that. And I'll hear what the rest of my colleagues have to say.
Thank you, Councilmember Borgens. Councilmember Bain.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll pick it up on that note, starting with thanking the committee, both the council members and our staff who worked on the report and the recommendations. I heard a lot of people say tonight that they were disappointed and or confused, and I hope that that won't discourage the committee. I think that some of the confusion comes from the way that the recommendations were framed, and I think some members of the community may be thinking that these are things that we're going to be voting on. I see it a bit differently, having been through numerous study sessions and seeing this really as the beginning of the dialogue. We have not had a meeting dedicated to these subjects, and so to me, this is where the conversation starts. A lot of comments have been made related to other subjects on our agenda, but this is the first time that we've really had a discussion about equity and how we provide services to the community, including policing. And to me, those are a bit different in terms of concepts, which I'll get back to in a second. A lot of the questions I have were related to the CAHOOTS model, which some of them have been discussed. I suppose that my question for the committee and our staff is, are we looking at moving more aggressively towards a model like that with the county? A model where a larger number of police calls could be handled by an independent group, perhaps out of the county health services, that would not be part of the police department.
So I'll start, and again, invite the chief to add on if you'd like. I think it would be helpful just to acknowledge we've only been working on this for a couple of months, and we haven't even finished the pilot to bring forward to the council. So I think absolutely we can look at something broader over time, and I would fully expect whatever it starts with is not where it ends up, but it isn't even fully formed yet in terms of what it will do and how well it will do that. So I think we feel like we need to start somewhere. We've been looking and trying to think about what are the best elements of other services and what's feasible for the coalition of the willing that we have within the county at this time. So that's kind of the beginning point that I very much think it could evolve over time, and it's a little difficult to predict.
Thank you. That's actually the answer that I expected. And I just have one other question, and then I'll move to some of my comments. My question is about the SRO, the school resource officer. Why do we still need that position?
So we were hoping to actually have a little more information for you today. Chief Mulholland and I met with Superintendent at the time, Stretchley, as well as the Sequoia High School Principal, Sean Priest, in early August to talk about the program. And not surprisingly, the subject of what the SRO does as a function and whether or not that was valuable is actively being discussed in the school community. So at the time, what we heard from leadership in the district and at the school was that they really valued the partnership with the police department, that they felt it was a constructive presence. There was openness to making sure that it was meeting community needs and that we had shared understanding the role was, and that for the representatives at the school, that they wanted to make sure they were hearing their own community concerns and potentially looking at some changes. So we're still in that dialogue process. We're scheduled to be meeting again this fall. They've been focusing on schooling and what that's going to look like. And so we don't have a detailed response on that, but that's why it's framed in the report as clarifying the role, is because they've been doing dialogue within the school community, and we're waiting to hear more from them about that to help us then make recommendations to the city council.
I wanted to add to that, Melissa, also they've had a change in staff where their superintendent is no longer there, and that was one person we were doing a lot of dialogue with. So we need to give it a little time, I think, before they'll get back to us. And that's why we really didn't come back at this time with a recommendation one way or the other.
Thank you, appreciate that. I'll just say that I think my recollection of the SRO was there was a time when we had a lot more violent incidents at our school than we do now, and that was really the driving force for putting that position there. So I do think that we need to rethink whether or not we need to have an officer at the school. I think the points about the message it sends are very valid, and I would take a really hard look at that. In terms of the cahoots model, I would like to see us move more aggressively towards a model like that, where it deals largely with our homeless population. And I think that has become a much more of a big percentage of what officers are dealing with these days, as the challenges and problems related to homelessness have grown exponentially in our community and neighboring communities over the last few years. So I think the conversation needs to be approached a bit differently. So I don't have any questions. I don't have any more questions for the committee. I don't have any questions for PCRC, but I will say that the listening sessions they served a purpose, but the listening sessions attracted a number of very vocal people who are very passionate, and as one of the speakers said, organized and aligned. And so when you're hearing a lot of voices that agree with you, it sounds like the whole community agrees with you. So I wouldn't take the output of that, the 500 people or so who have an agenda of descoping and defunding, as representing the entire community of 85,000 people that we represent. I also, I still continue to hear people occasionally speak for Black and brown people in our community. I would strongly encourage those of you who are trying to drive change to speak for yourself and let everybody else speak for themselves. Change happens over time through persuasion, not through harassment or intimidation or shaming, public shaming, or whatever techniques have worked at other levels of government. These are some hard conversations. Easy changes take forever in city government. I can tell you that from experience. Hard changes are really hard, and they take a long time. So for things to change, people are going to have to be patient, and they're going to have to use persuasion and good arguments to make those changes. I'm going to say that I think descoping and defunding the police is the wrong way to frame the conversation. The way to frame the conversation is, how do we provide the right services to the community at the right level of funding? We know that homelessness is a serious challenge. We know that we're going to have to put resources towards solving some of those challenges. We know that we can't do it alone. We're going to have to do it in partnership with the county, and we're going to be bringing back a conversation about the county's functional zero vision and how we can work with them on building a navigation center in Redwood City to help address some of these issues. That is going to require funding, and that is going to have to come from somewhere. I would rather overinvest in some of those things in the short term and then realize we don't need quite as many sworn officers because we're not dealing with as many of those incidents. That's the way that I think we need to approach this very thoughtfully. To simply say we need to cut 20% out of our budget because the police are too militarized, that's not a responsible way to govern a city. The responsible way, again, is to look at it as what services are needed, what do they cost, how do we fund them, and are we balancing things in the right places? I think a dialogue like that will be much more interactive, much more collaborative, much less off-putting to people who are averse to change, and may be able to help advance some of those discussions a bit more. In terms of the last point, I'll go back to one of the first things I said, which is, to me, equity and policing are two separate things. And I'm glad that we're making equity one of our guiding principles. I support the development of an equity work plan. And I think that having a council subcommittee work on an equity work plan is the right way to approach it with input from the community. In terms of policing, I also support the recommendation of some sort of citizens committee focused on how do we provide the best possible policing services to the community. And that could include an annual review of police policies to ensure that there is no form of bias, to ensure that we are providing the safest, most equitable policing possible in our community. And those two things are not, they may go down parallel tracks, but I think Councilmember Hale actually hit on something earlier that I wanted to bring up in terms of, I think we now have a model for council members to work with a board, committee, and commission that actually works, and that resulted in the safe parking program. We used to have disconnects between what the council was doing and what the BCCs were doing. And we would hear from the BCCs, we don't know what the council wants. And we'd hear from council members saying the BCC is going off and doing its own thing. However, we created a successful model that worked. And I would like to see those two things come together. Perhaps a subcommittee of the council focused on equity meets with a citizens committee focused on providing best possible policing services. And those two efforts align. So I think we have a lot more work to do, a lot more discussion on this. Again, I want to thank the committee for all their hard work. And I do want to thank our chief, because I know he has been working very hard on all of these issues, even before the George Floyd incident. He is a good person, and he's working, he's got a really tough job. So I appreciate everybody trying to improve policing and being very patient, being very respectful, and working with others on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bain. Vice Mayor Mazur.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councilmember Bain. I appreciate what you said, your perspective, and I like how you sort of brought around some of the recommendations around in the committees, building on what some of our colleagues have said. And I think it's definitely moving in the right direction. A couple of just things to note and one question. Maybe I'll just start with my question, which is for Melissa Natana Jones. Melissa, I think it's for you. We saw a report out of the responses from the community listening sessions, but you guys, as you described, also went out to the community and talked to people while they were accessing services, picking up food, etc. And I don't know that we saw, I hear you, and we had a chance to talk about this in the subcommittee as well, that for many people who you spoke with at the time you were speaking with them, that while they weren't saying that it wasn't an issue of importance, it wasn't the primary issue that they were worried about at the moment. They were worried about food, or they were worried about paying rent, or they were worried about their health. So I'm just wondering, do we have any responses specifically related to the types of questions that we asked in the community listening sessions that are reflective of the same responses that we heard in the community listening sessions? If we don't, and I apologize for not asking this before tonight, and if we don't, that's fine. I just want to know.
I feel like I can answer that.
Oh, thanks, Jose.
So the responses were put together in the themes, and so there wasn't a separate response for the community outreach and or the questionnaires that were put out into in the community in that way.
Okay. Because the way that you themed things, it looked like it was directly from the responses to the polls and the community listening sessions, not necessarily out talking to people. But that's fine.
I can add, Shelley, if
Oh,
that's
great.
if it's helpful.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
So the questions that were asked both through the community pop-up sessions and electronic surveys that were provided to our strategic partners for outreach were the same questions that were shared in the community dialogue sessions. So the feedback that we received was incorporated, just like Jose said, within the buckets of themes that he heard feedback, and that's how he responded to it. If you need us to, we can add a little bit more information about the outreach and who was outreached to. We don't have a lot of information of demographics because it was anonymous. We, one of the things that we definitely heard is there were segments of the population who were afraid to come and present themselves in a community forum because it wasn't something that was anonymous. You had to pre-register, you had to identify who you were, put on your audio and video. And so a lot of what we received, either electronic feedback or through our community partners, was anonymous and kept anonymous. So we don't have demographic information or breakdown of it, but we do know based on who that particular strategic partner works with that it was predominantly people of color, immigrant populations, and lower economic status individuals with kind of that fall within that lower economic status. So I hope that provides a little bit more information, council member.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think it's something for us to talk about maybe in our next ad hoc meeting as well, because one of the things that we talked about is the need to do additional outreach. And one of the things that the Stanford researcher provided us with was some ideas and approaches that have been used in other cities that made it possible for people like you just described, Michelle, who didn't necessarily feel comfortable participating publicly and sharing their name and any additional information about themselves. But there were some models that we heard that I think, again, somebody mentioned earlier, working with the faith communities to really get some additional information and hear from other members of the community who didn't participate in our community listening sessions. So while I'm on the Stanford research, I think what is critical about what she provided us with were short and long-term approaches. And it fell into 3 buckets: data collection and standards, culture change, which has been mentioned a few times, and then independent oversight. And so we've talked about each of these, and we've talked about moving forward in the short term already in each of these areas. And so one of the issues was raised, one of the speakers asked about how do we understand and assess the level of trust, and that's one of the things that we talked to the researcher about, is how do we do that? And so I think it's another area of further work for us as a city to do some broader, and it sort of goes hand in hand with the additional outreach, to do some broader work to understand where are we on that level of trust spectrum, and then that informs some of the additional work that we do or changes that we make. I do appreciate the approach of working across cities for any kind of changes that we're making, in particular the mental health. I just, Eugene is almost, it's about a little over 2 times the size of Redwood City, and is just it's a different city, but I think that's the reason that we can partner with other cities. And again, back to the data collection, understanding what are the number of calls that we have for mental health services, what are the number of calls that the other cities have for mental health services, so that we can then adequately staff with mental health partners to help us respond to those calls adequately. But again, it's a place where we still need to do a little bit more work. And I think Melissa and Dan, that's where you guys are trying to do some further assessment along with the other cities that we're proposing to partner with and the county to understand what is the level of staffing we're going to need to adequately respond to calls with mental health professionals. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And if there's time a little later, the chief actually has some fairly recent information about that that might be useful.
Yes, that's correct. Just for clarification, the percentage of our time from 2015 to 2019, about 5% of our time at the police department, or 5% of our calls for service, focus around people in mental health crisis or in need of assistance related to mental health concerns. Comes out to about 22,300 plus calls for service during that entire time span between 2015 to 2019. And to piggyback on some of the comments that were made by Councilmember Bain earlier, in addition to the mental health component of the pilot program that we're considering, there would also be a homeless outreach component to that as well. So in addition to supporting people in need for mental health concerns, there would also be that offering assistance for those that are suffering from substance abuse or addiction, and then also homeless outreach. Our homeless outreach related calls for service, interestingly enough, also runs about 5% of our time during that same period. So the two are very close. So between those two during that time frame, that was represented about 10% of the calls for service that we handle.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Quick question for you, maybe, Chief, on that. In the model that's being proposed, you described the training and the ability for people to work together. And if you don't know this yet, that's okay, but it's something I would like to know eventually, which is if there is a mental health service call, the counselor goes out or the therapist goes out with an officer, who makes the call as to what happens? And how do you have a sense of how that might work, or is that something you guys are still talking about?
Well, we do. That is something we're talking about, and what we would envision in a case where you have, say, an emergency crisis situation where there's a threat. Well, they would kind of tag team that. There may be a time where the police representative that was there would start that de-escalation process, and then could step back and let the mental health professional continue. But ideally, once, assuming everything is stabilized, they work in partnership with that, then we would envision a point where the police representative would then step back and let the mental health professional then work either to determine an appropriate level of care, or maybe a more specific diagnosis of what type of crisis the person is in, or determine if placement on a 72-hour mental health hold may be in order. We would look to the mental health professional more to do that, and you would see that gradual shift away from what our officers would do in the field, and then passing off those responsibilities to the clinician that's working with the police department.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. I think what we've heard and what we've seen, and so I think as you further work on this, is that the mental health clinician is the forward, the front-facing person that is working on the de-escalation, et cetera. But we don't need to have a full conversation about that now, but I do fully agree that the more we can move towards that model, and the faster we can do it with the data that we know, the better. A couple of last things on the schools issue. I think that what is going to be critical is to work with Redwood City 2020 over the next 6 to 12 months. I did reach out and invite school board members to attend the community listening sessions. Some did. Some attended the youth listening sessions. Some attended the general listening sessions. I specifically did that because we did hear so frequently about concerns about the schools, and wanted to make sure that the people who are directly responsible for making the decisions had a chance to hear those as well. But I think there is some further opportunity within 2020 as we formulate our next strategic areas of strategic focus to continue to work on equity and how the city can help working with the schools on that. And then on the equity plan, Melissa, what's the timing that we're thinking about on the equity work plan?
So first, we were testing it tonight with a full council, and I'm hearing pretty strong support. So what you would see in the budget recommendation at the end of the month would be over the course of the remainder of the fiscal year, we would work together to develop the work plan. And I'm thinking a lot based on feedback that's being given tonight about what the best way to do that is, and thinking about the ideas that have been suggested about, partnering maybe a council committee with a commission, maybe an existing commission. I'm thinking about the HHCC's role, for example, that has a lot of overlap on these issues. So we'll mull on that in the next couple weeks and give you some recommendations. But the work plan will take some time to develop. It won't be done by the October meeting. It would happen through the course of the year.
Okay, thanks. And then the last thing I just want to say is I just want to echo Councilmember Hale, who raised housing. I think, anybody who's read The Color of Law understands that housing is a key and critical component, an element of systemic racism, and how we as a city choose to put into operation our fundamental equity principle, assuming that council agrees to pass that addition to the strategic plan, has to have a look at housing and how zoning has impacted people's lives for at least 100 years. And so with that, I will just say thanks to my colleagues for allowing me to participate in this committee, and thanks to the staff and PCRC for helping us do this work.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Mazur. Councilmember Aguirre?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I agree with a lot of things that you had mentioned, and I want to thank everyone on the committee, especially all the community members that came forward tonight to give us their thoughts, and PCRC and my colleagues on the committee, and also the staff. What I've heard over and over is that poverty is the issue that is at the core of all this. And when we think of how all of this started, it started with an issue of lack of equity, with the George Floyd issue, but it related to policing. So when I think about what we're trying to accomplish in all of the meetings that we've had, we know that equity has to be at the top of the lens, just as I mentioned earlier. And, it's because of lack of equity that we have the issues of poverty, education, homelessness, food insecurity, et cetera, including policing, right? So to me, that is the discussion that we need to have based on the redlining of how housing happened when we first built our cities, and that was mentioned also. But, that's something that we are tasked with, and I accept the challenge of being tasked with homelessness, with housing, and that's something that I think is at the core of all the strategic goals that we've been discussing this year, and even within this committee, and even when we were looking at the issues of equity and how we bring that into our strategic goals. Just a little bit of history. I don't know if Councilmember Bain or Mayor Howard remember, but the SROs, historically, it was the schools that requested these. There was a time when we actually cut the budget, and when we had to really cut our budget for recession, and we were looking at cutting the SROs from all the schools. And we had the parents and the community and the teachers and the principals came and said, please, this is such a needed service to our students in our schools. So that's kind of a little bit of history. Of course, things change. We're in a different time now, so we're looking at it with a different lens. And, sometimes it's not that I think the police was imposing or the city imposing. We had to actually find a way as a city to help fund that, because it wasn't in our budget. So just, a little bit of, because the schools, the parents really felt that was important to them. This is a messy process. Change is messy, and when I heard a lot about is us and you, and I hope that it continues to be we, that, you know, we're coming forward. I really cherish the different opinions and I want to hear them, but I want to be heard back, and I want to make sure that you know that this process is going to be messy. I embrace the idea of citizens committees and oversight committees. What does that look like? It has to start with this process that we're beginning. You know, I was really excited about working with the mental health professionals when I saw the report, because I think that that's one of the areas that we're lacking as a city. But when you think about that, if every city is going to be asking for mental health professionals from the county, it really has to be kind of a partnering project process. And so what does that look like? So I'm looking forward to continuing to ask. I always ask in these committees, what are other cities like us doing, and how are we not moving fast enough? And what do we need to do to get to a place where equity is at least being addressed in as many of the areas that are of our city services that we can continue to do. So I just want to end by saying I want to thank everyone again for being here, and that we heard from everyone. But, you know, we also heard from other folks that weren't part of the dialogues, that were afraid to go to the dialogues, that have a different point of view. And we've heard those in emails and other folks that have come to us. So we're trying to continue to balance the needs of a full community that includes folks, you know, of all ages, our senior community, our youth especially, and want to make sure that we continue to have those voices. And the one thing that I heard over and over is that, you know, we didn't know we could talk about these things. We didn't know we could bring up these issues. I found a place to do it. Now I know. So again, it was just the initial piece, and I think it has to continue. Again, it's a process. It's going to be messy. I'm glad we're starting it, and I look forward to continuing to hear from the community, my colleagues, and see how we can improve this, because there are a lot of things that we can tackle and a lot of things that we need support with, because we can't do it alone as a city. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman Aguirre. I hope it's not too messy, though. I just wanted to say thank you so much. I'll finish by saying thank you to Councilmember Aguirre and Vice Mayor Mazur for working with me on this committee. I really have learned so very much, and I look forward to learning much more. I wanted to thank the other members of council. There's a good reason why we have 7 council members. Look at the brain trust we have here. Everyone brought something to the table tonight. Everyone had suggestions and good ideas. I'm always grateful that I have such a council who's willing to step up and think outside the box and work together on finding solutions for this community. I'd like to thank, of course, PCRC. You were wonderful. Really appreciate it. I hope we'll work with you again in the near future, because I know we have a lot more outreach to do. And I think it would be helpful with your suggestions that we work together on that in the future. I'd like to thank our city staff. There are many, many staff members who are involved in this research and work. And in particular, I'd like to thank our city manager, Melissa Stevenson Diaz, and the police chief, Dan Mulholland. I wanted to say that Friday before, it was the night that Councilmember Reddy was mentioning, when there was a disruption to a peaceful demonstration at the time. I wanted to say I was witness to it. My husband and I were there, and I watched as several people who came from outside our community with an intention to do harm, not to speak for peace, not to speak for anyone, but to cause harm. And I watched as our police officers stood there with people, several people, in their face, yelling obscenities, yelling the worst language that anyone would ever want to hear, at several of our officers. And they stood there. Our officers stood there. They didn't flinch. They were professional. They just stood there, and they were composed. They did their job. They just stood there and they took it. And that had to be so hurtful, but they did their job. And I was just so proud at that moment of the department that we have. Do we have things we can change within our department? That's what we're looking at, and we're very willing to try. But I did want to let you know that the people in this community should feel very safe with what I witnessed that last Friday. That could have turned into a very ugly situation, but their calm and their professionalism kept that from happening. So I would like to say thank you publicly to our Redwood City Police Department for the way they handled a difficult situation, and thank our chief, who is their leader, for how he handles these situations. Very calm and very professional. I look forward to future conversations with the community. We have many different issues, especially with COVID happening now. Many people are feeling more desperate than they ever have before. So I know there's opportunity for us to engage with the community. But I am anxious to support the concept and get started on an equity work plan. I know we can do this. We have the willingness to do it. As far as our boards, committees, and commissions and our staff, I think all of us need to look at ourselves and say we could all use some training. I'm not worried about that part. I think everyone will participate. But I am looking forward to moving forward in the right direction in bringing Redwood City forward. Councilmember Reddy said we're not Minnesota and we're not Louisiana. And I'd like to add, we're not Seattle. And the reason I mentioned Seattle was because what I witnessed in Seattle was a mayor and a police chief who didn't understand each other and did not communicate. I saw repeatedly the mayor and the council let people do things they shouldn't be doing and thwarting the efforts of the police department. And that police chief, from all accounts, and I did research on her, was quite a good police chief. She resigned. She said, I am not getting the support I need from the staff or from my council and my mayor. And what a loss for that city. So I feel very grateful that we have the great relationship we do with our police chief and our staff, because we're in it together. That's how we're going to solve these problems. Talk to each other, work with each other, be tolerant of each other. And as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, real change, enduring change happens one step at a time. And that's what we'll be doing. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank everyone who attended. We had about, I think, 65 participants come and listen to us tonight. Thank you. Stay engaged. I want to thank all of you. And when you go home, I hope, please practice what we've been saying. Wear your mask, wash your hands, keep 6 feet of distance, because we all want to keep each other safe. So I'd like to adjourn this meeting now until our next meeting, which will be October the 12th. Everyone stay safe and have a good night. Thank you.